New York City. The hustle and bustle of the city never stops, and neither does the noise. People rush to work, taxis honk as they weave through traffic, and the towering buildings seem to touch the sky. But amid the chaos, one person stands still, Michael O'Connor, a homeless veteran. It's early afternoon, and the crowds are thick outside Trump Tower. The winter air bites at the skin, and the scent of hot dogs and street vendors fills the air, but Michael barely notices. His rough, weathered face, with graying stubble and eyes that have seen too much, tells the story of a man who's lived through battles, both overseas and right here on the streets of New York. Michael's clothes are tattered. His jacket, once a proud military-issued item, is now faded and torn. A sign hangs loosely around his neck, scribbled in messy handwriting. "Can you give me $1?" He holds it up with trembling hands, his face a mixture of defiance and despair. There's no pride left, only survival. His eyes scan the sea of well-dressed people rushing past him. Executives, tourists, people who seem like they have a destination, a purpose. People who don't even glance in his direction. The winter sun is hidden behind clouds, casting a gray hue over the concrete jungle. Michael pulls his jacket tighter around him, trying to ward off the cold that seems to seep into his bones. He's been here for hours, barely speaking to anyone. Sometimes he gets a quarter tossed into his cup, sometimes nothing at all. But he keeps going, knowing he has no other choice. Then, as if by fate, he notices him, Barron Trump, the son of the former president, the youngest member of the Trump family. Barron is tall for his age, dressed in a sharp coat, walking with his usual quiet confidence, flanked by his security detail. Michael's heart skips a beat. He's seen Barron on TV, in the tabloids, but today, Barron isn't just a figure on a screen. He's real. He's here. And for a moment, Michael wonders if this encounter could be different. Maybe Barron Trump will see him. Maybe Barron will give him something, anything. "Can you give me $1?" The words escape Michael's lips before he even thinks about them. It's a simple request, one he's made hundreds of times before. But something feels different this time. His voice cracks slightly, and he wonders if Barron will even hear him in the rush of the crowd. For a split second, Barron doesn't respond. He keeps walking, his eyes fixed forward, as though the world around him is moving in fast forward while he's stuck in slow motion. The crowd continues to buzz, people walking by, not stopping, not even sparing a glance. But then, Barron stops. The noise of the city fades away as if the moment has slowed. Barron stands still for a moment, his eyes drifting from the busy world around him to Michael's face. There's something in the boy's expression, something almost human. He looks at Michael with a kind of curiosity, then a subtle nod. His bodyguard steps forward, but Barron raises a hand, signaling for him to stay back. The moment stretches, and for the first time in what feels like years, Michael feels like he's being seen. The people around them continue to walk by, oblivious to the oddity of the moment, but for Michael and Barron, time seems to stand still. "Why $1?" Barron asks, his voice soft, but his question cuts through the air like a quiet challenge. It's a simple question, but it's one that Michael has never been asked before. Most people either ignore him or give him a pitying look, but this feels different. Michael's mind races. Why $1? It's a good question. His usual answer would be something about survival, about needing just a little help to get by. But today, he can't quite find the words. All he knows is that $1 could buy him something small, maybe a warm coffee, or some bread. Maybe just the smallest sense of dignity. Just enough to get through the day, Michael says, his voice raspy, his words more honest than he's spoken in a long time. Barron looks down at the sign again, as if pondering the weight of those few words. The crowd behind him seems to fade into the background, as though they are no longer part of the story. For a brief, fleeting moment, it's just Barron and Michael. One is young, with the world ahead of him, and the other is a man weathered by life, lost in the struggle to survive. Then, Barron surprises him. "I can't just give you $1, Barron says, looking directly into Michael's eyes. The crowd moves around them, but Barron stands still, his expression thoughtful. "But I can help you in a different way." Michael blinks, unsure if he heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" Barron's next words leave Michael speechless. "Come with me," Barron says, gesturing toward the entrance of Trump Tower. "Let's talk. I think we can figure something out. I don't want to just throw money at your problem, but maybe there's something I can do." The people around them continue their fast-paced lives, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding at the gates of the tower. For Michael, the world seems to stop as he processes what Barron just said. He can't believe it. This isn't how it usually goes. No one ever takes the time to talk, to offer more than just spare change. Yet here is Barron Trump, offering not just $1, but something far more valuable, an opportunity. The security guards seem a bit uneasy, but Barron doesn't look back. He just stands there, waiting, like he's offering a lifeline. Michael hesitates, the weight of his past pressing on him. This isn't the kind of help he's used to. It's not a handout. It's something different. "Are you serious?" Michael asks, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Barron gives a small nod, his gaze unwavering. "I'm serious. Come with me. Let's see what we can do." And in that moment, Michael's life takes an unexpected turn. The story has begun. A chance encounter, a moment of connection, and a young man who might just change everything for a struggling veteran. The door to Trump Tower opens with a soft whoosh of air, and Michael follows Barron inside, still unsure if this moment is real or just some bizarre dream. The cold of the city streets seems to disappear as the warmth of the building wraps around him. It's an odd feeling. He's been used to the sharp bite of winter, to the smell of decay and waste that clings to him. But inside this sleek, marble-floored lobby, everything feels clean, almost too clean. Barron walks ahead, with his bodyguards trailing behind at a respectful distance. Michael's eyes dart around the space, taking in the glistening chandelier overhead, the polished floors that reflect his worn shoes, and the tall glass windows that offer a view of the busy streets below. He feels out of place, like a man wearing the wrong clothes at a wedding. But Barron doesn't seem to care. He doesn't make small talk, just leads Michael to a private lounge area, where a few plush chairs surround a low table. He motions for Michael to sit. Michael does, hesitantly, sinking into the chair, which feels like it might swallow him whole. He's not used to being treated like this, treated like someone with worth. The weight of his past presses on him, and he suddenly feels like an imposter in this world of wealth and privilege. Barron takes a seat across from him, folding his arms. He looks at Michael with an intensity that makes Michael squirm a little. There's no judgment in Barron's eyes, just curiosity and maybe something else. Empathy? "I don't usually do this," Barron says after a long pause, his voice calm but direct. "I don't really talk to people like you on the street. But I don't know. Something about you caught my attention." Michael swallows hard. He's not sure how to respond. The words feel foreign in his mouth. He doesn't belong here. He's not the kind of person Barron should be talking to. A part of him wonders if this is some kind of prank, if he's going to be laughed at in a few minutes. But he knows Barron's not the kind of person who would waste his time on something like that. So, instead of doubting, he takes a deep breath and begins to speak. "I don't expect much from anyone," Michael says, his voice rough and weathered. I don't even know why I asked you for $1. It's stupid. I've been out here for too long. People just walk by, like I'm invisible, like I don't even exist." He pauses, the weight of his own words settling on him. "But I do exist. I was someone, once. I had a life, a future." Barron listens quietly, his expression unreadable. It's clear he's not rushing Michael, not pushing him to say anything. For the first time in a long time, Michael feels the need to speak his truth. The words spill out, unbidden. "I joined the army when I was 18. I wanted to serve, to be something. I thought I was doing something good, something right. I wanted to protect people, you know? I thought if I could fight for my country, I'd find my place in the world." Michael's eyes grow distant, lost in the past. The room seems to fade away, and he's back in the desert, back in that heat. The sand stinging his skin, the smoke filling the air, the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears. He blinks and shakes his head, trying to clear it. "I was sent to Iraq. I was a sniper. Things happen there. Bad things. I saw stuff that no one should ever see. You can't just erase that from your head." You don't get to come back and act like it never happened. Barron doesn't interrupt. He doesn't flinch or look away. He just watches Michael, his gaze steady and patient. I came home broken. I thought I'd be a hero. Thought I'd come back and get a parade or something. But there was no parade. There was just me. And I didn't know who I was anymore. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. I started drinking. Couldn't keep a job. I pushed everyone away. Michael lets out a long breath, like a weight he's been carrying for years has shifted, if only slightly. I lost my wife. I lost my kid. And then one day, I just found myself on the streets. It wasn't like one big thing, you know? It was just everything slowly falling apart until I didn't have anything left. He looks down at his hands, worn and scarred, the calluses from years of hard work and the roughness of street life. He doesn't want to look up, doesn't want to meet Barron's eyes, afraid of what he'll see there. But Barron's gaze remains steady, not pitying, not condemning, just understanding. I've been out here for 5 years now, Michael continues, voice quieter now. I get by. I make it through the day. I've learned how to survive. But I don't know what I'm surviving for anymore. There's a long pause between them. Barron sits back, his face unreadable. For a moment, it seems like Michael has said too much. Like he's gone too deep into the story he's been trying to bury for so long. But then Barron speaks. You're not invisible to me, he says simply, breaking the silence. Michael's eyes snap up, surprised. What? Barron leans forward, his hands folded on the table. You're not invisible to me. You're a person. You're someone who deserves to be seen. And you're right. You don't have to survive this alone. Michael swallows hard, the emotion threatening to choke him. He's not sure what he expected from this encounter, but this is more than he ever could have hoped for. Maybe I can't fix everything. I can't give you back your wife or your son, Barron continues, his voice steady. But I can help you find something worth fighting for again. You don't have to do this alone. Michael's chest tightens. He feels the heavy weight of hope rising in his throat. It's a feeling he hasn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. For the first time in years, he thinks maybe he could get back up. Maybe he could try again. In this chapter, we've dived deep into Michael's past, his pain, his regrets, and his struggles. Barron, through his quiet yet firm presence, begins to offer Michael something more than just a handout. He offers him the possibility of a new beginning, a chance at redemption. But the path forward will not be easy, and Michael has to confront his demons before he can truly move forward. The quiet hum of the Trump Tower lobby lingers in the air as Michael sits across from Barron, still absorbing the gravity of what just happened. He's used to silence, the kind that comes from loneliness and isolation, but this silence feels different. It's almost like the calm before something big, something life-changing. For the first time in a long time, Michael isn't sure what to expect next. Barron takes out his phone and taps a few keys. The soft click of the touch screen echoes in the stillness between them. I'm going to set up a meeting for you tomorrow, Barron says, his fingers still moving across the screen. It's with a veterans outreach organization that might be able to help. They can assist with housing, therapy, job placement, whatever you need. Michael blinks, trying to process the words. A meeting. A chance. It's almost too much to take in at once. This wasn't just an act of kindness. It felt like Barron had a plan, a way out for him. You're not just giving me money? Michael asks cautiously, his voice hoarse. He's used to people offering $1 here and there, or the occasional meal. But this is something entirely different. Barron shakes his head, his eyes focused on the screen in front of him. No, I don't think that's the answer. Money can't fix everything, Michael. It might help in the short term, but you need more than that. You need support, structure, a way to rebuild your life. Michael feels a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this conversation to take this turn. No one had ever talked to him like this before. Like he was a person who still had potential, who still had a future worth fighting for. I'm not sure I'm ready for that, Michael says quietly. His hands grip the edge of the chair, feeling the cold leather beneath his fingers. I've been on my own for too long. I don't know how to trust people anymore. It feels like a lot. Barron looks up from his phone and meets Michael's gaze. There's a quiet intensity in his eyes, something far beyond his years. Despite the wealth, the family name, the privileges that come with being a Trump, Barron seems entirely grounded in the moment. "You don't have to do this alone," Barron says simply. "I know it's scary, but I can help you figure out the first steps. And after that, it's up to you to keep moving forward. But you're not alone. Not anymore." Michael can't help but feel a swell of gratitude that he hasn't felt in years. The words settle into his chest, warming him from the inside out. He doesn't know where this road will lead, but for the first time in a long time, he feels like maybe, just maybe, he can walk it. Later that night, Michael stumbles back to his usual spot on the corner, the familiar sound of the city rushing past him like an unyielding tide. He hasn't been gone long, but it feels like he's been living in two different worlds. Inside Trump Tower, everything had felt so alien to him. The polished marble floors, the soft lighting, the sense of security that clung to the space like a thick fog. Out here, though, it's the streets that feel real. The rumble of the subway beneath his feet, the shrill cry of the homeless woman across the street who calls out to no one in particular, the distant sirens. This is the world he's known. This is the place where he belongs, even if he doesn't want to. But tonight, something's different. As Michael walks back to his usual spot on the sidewalk, he notices the people passing by. There's something that sets this moment apart from all the others. They're moving fast, like always, but Michael feels like he's standing still, like he's in a different place now. His hand tightens around the crumpled sign in his coat pocket. "Can you give me $1?" For a moment, he just stands there, letting the thoughts swirl around him. It's strange, almost too surreal to process. He had been so close to walking away from everything. The idea of rebuilding, of finding a new purpose. And now, for the first time, the thought doesn't seem impossible. The next morning, the following day, Michael wakes up to the same cold, gray sky that has greeted him for as long as he can remember. It's early, too early for anyone else to be on the streets, but Michael rises, stretches, and moves toward the address Barron had given him the night before. He's nervous, his stomach churning with anxiety. What if this is all a mistake? What if Barron's promises are empty? What if he's just going to get his hopes crushed once again? But then he thinks back to Barron's words, "You're not alone. Not anymore." He clings to that thought as he makes his way through the streets, his breath visible in the frigid morning air. His boots crunch against the snow, his hands jammed deep in his pockets. It feels like he's walking toward something big, something that could change everything. When Michael reaches the building, he hesitates. It's a large, nondescript office, the kind that blends in with the other buildings on the block. But there's a sense of urgency in his chest. He doesn't want to wait anymore. He pushes the door open and steps inside. The receptionist greets him with a smile, but there's something in her eyes that tells him she's seen too many people like him walk through that door. Veterans, the broken, the forgotten. She offers him a seat in the waiting area, and Michael notices the walls lined with posters that say things like, "You are not alone, healing starts here, and a new beginning awaits." He sits down, trying to calm his racing heart. A few minutes later, a man in his 50s with glasses and a soft, welcoming face steps into the room. He's wearing a worn suit, the kind that's seen better days but still manages to maintain a professional air. "Michael?" the man asks gently. "Yeah," Michael replies, his voice strained. "That's me." The man extends a hand, his grip firm but not overpowering. "I'm Frank. It's good to meet you. Barron told us you'd be coming by." Michael nods. The mention of Barron's name is like a lifeline, a thread that connects him to something beyond the streets. "You're in the right place," Frank says with a smile. "We're here to help. Now, let's talk about what comes next." The door to the office closes behind Michael with a soft click, and for a moment, he feels like he's stepped into another world. Inside the Veterans Outreach Center, everything is different. The air smells clean. The walls are painted in warm tones, and there's a sense of calm in the atmosphere that he hasn't felt in years. It's a stark contrast to the chaos of the streets he's known for so long. Frank, the man who greeted him, motions for Michael to sit at a desk covered in files and papers. The man's demeanor is kind but professional, as if he's used to dealing with people who have seen things things that are hard to talk about. Michael can feel his own guard rising as he sits down, his hands resting nervously on his lap. The last time he'd been in a room like this, it had been for job interviews that led nowhere, or therapy sessions where he sat through long silences, waiting for something, anything, to click. But today feels different. Frank pulls out a form from a folder, looks at it briefly, then back at Michael. Barron gave us a heads up about your situation. I know it's not easy to come in here, but you're making the right choice. I want to help you, Michael. Whatever it takes. Michael looks down at his hands. He's not used to hearing people talk to him this way, like they actually care. In the past, people saw him as just another homeless vet, just another statistic. But here, Frank doesn't look at him with pity. He looks at him like he's someone who matters. And it's unsettling in a way. You've been out on the streets for 5 years, right? Frank asks, his voice calm, steady. Michael nods slowly. Yeah, 5 years. I've lost count of how many times I've asked for help and ended up back here. I don't even know where to start. Frank gives him a soft smile. That's okay. We all start somewhere. And I think you're in the right place to start over. Michael isn't sure how to respond. A part of him wants to believe Frank, wants to trust that this is the beginning of something better. But another part of him, the part that's been hurt too many times, wants to shut down. He doesn't know how to hope anymore. Frank leans forward slightly, sensing the hesitation. Let's take it one step at a time. I want to get to know you better. What's your story? How did you end up here? Michael's heart pounds a little harder. He hasn't talked about this in so long. It's easier to pretend like the past doesn't exist. But Frank's waiting, and there's something about the way he's looking at him that makes Michael feel like it's okay to speak. I joined the army when I was 18. Michael begins, his voice low and rough. It was my way out of a life I didn't want. My family didn't have much, and I thought the military would give me a sense of purpose. I was good at it. I was a sniper. I thought I was doing something noble, something important. I thought I was making a difference. He pauses, swallowing the lump in his throat. Frank doesn't interrupt, just waits patiently, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. But war changes you. You don't come back from something like that the same person. I saw things, did things I can't ever forget. And when I came back, I couldn't just pick up where I left off. I didn't fit in. I didn't know who I was anymore. And everything started falling apart. Michael's words hang in the air, heavy with the weight of years of pain. He looks at Frank, unsure if he shared too much, but the other man just nods in understanding. That's the thing about trauma, Frank says gently. It doesn't just go away because you're home. And when you try to ignore it, it can eat you alive. But I need you to understand something. There's no shame in where you are right now. No shame in asking for help. Michael's eyes flicker toward the floor. I didn't want to end up like this. I didn't want to be on the streets, begging for change. But here I am. You're here because you made it through all of that, Frank responds, his voice firm with conviction. You've survived things that most people can't even imagine. And just by being here today, you've already taken the first step toward changing your life. This, Frank gestures around the room, indicating the center's warm, welcoming environment. This is where it starts. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Michael takes a deep breath, the tears threatening to spill. He quickly wipes them away, as if ashamed of the vulnerability he's just revealed. But Frank doesn't seem bothered. Instead, he hands Michael a small packet of forms and brochures, detailing the services they provide. We have housing programs, therapy, job placement assistance, and community support. But most importantly, we have people who care, people who understand. Take a look at these. Think about what you need right now. We're here to help you make a plan. Michael nods, his hands shaking slightly as he takes the papers from Frank. His heart is pounding in his chest. He can feel the weight of this moment, this chance, and it scares him more than anything. He's afraid to hope again, afraid to trust that something good can actually come from this. But as he looks down at the forms in his hands, something stirs inside him, a tiny seed of possibility. Later that day, Michael steps back onto the busy streets of New York City, his mind reeling. The sunlight hits his face, and he blinks, squinting against the brightness. It feels like the world around him hasn't changed at all. People are still rushing by, cars honking, the same noise and chaos. But inside, he feels different. Something inside him has shifted, even if he doesn't fully understand it yet. As he walks back toward his usual spot, his thoughts are consumed by the conversation with Frank. He's been given a chance, an opportunity to rebuild his life. And for the first time in years, he feels like he's not just surviving, but living. There's something terrifying about it, but also something exhilarating. Michael knows the road ahead won't be easy. It never is. But for the first time, he feels like maybe, just maybe, he can take that first step toward a new beginning. He's not sure what that future looks like yet, but he knows one thing for sure. He's not alone anymore. As he reaches the corner where he usually stands, he sees the same old faces, the same tired eyes, the same despair. But today, Michael doesn't just see them. He feels them. And for the first time, he realizes that he's not the only one stuck in this cycle. There are others, just like him, who need a hand, a lifeline, just like he did. Maybe in time, he can help them too. The wind is cold as Michael walks the familiar streets of New York, the city buzzing around him like it always does. But today, it feels different. For the first time in years, he isn't walking aimlessly. He isn't just trying to get through another day or waiting for the sun to set so he can collapse into sleep. No, today there's a plan. Today, he's taking the first step in a journey that could change everything. He grips the papers Frank gave him tighter, the corners of the brochures digging into his palm. He knows it's not going to be easy, hell. It's been too long since he trusted anything or anyone. But as he looks at the papers again, something inside him stirs. He's always been the type to fight, to survive. But surviving and living are two very different things. For the first time in a long time, Michael is starting to see the difference. The next day, Michael stands outside the Veterans Outreach Center, staring at the door for what feels like an eternity. He's not sure if it's the cold air biting into his skin or the anxiety knotting in his stomach, but something keeps him rooted to the spot. He knows he has to go in. He knows this could be his chance to finally change everything. But the fear? The fear is still there. He swallows hard and pushes open the door, stepping into the warmth of the building. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with short dark hair, looks up with a friendly smile. "Hi there. You must be Michael. Frank's expecting you," she says, her voice light but welcoming. Michael nods, giving her a small, uncertain smile. "Yeah, that's me." The receptionist motions to a hallway behind her. "Just head down to room 204. Frank should be in there." Michael doesn't say anything as he walks down the hall. The walls are lined with framed photographs of veterans, men and women of all ages, faces full of determination. Some look like they've seen things that would haunt a lifetime, while others wear smiles of hard-earned pride. The photos seem to tell a story, and as Michael walks past them, he feels a flicker of something inside him. Hope? Understanding? Maybe both. He reaches room 204, knocks on the door, and opens it when Frank calls out, "Come in." Frank is sitting behind a desk, typing away at his computer. He looks up when Michael enters, his face lighting up with recognition. "Michael, good to see you again. How are you feeling today?" Michael takes a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm okay. Nervous, I guess." Frank nods knowingly, as if he's seen this 100 times before. "It's totally normal to feel that way. You've taken a huge step by even walking through that door. Now, let's see where we can take this next." Michael takes a seat across from Frank, who hands him a new packet of papers, this one full of forms for housing, therapy, job training, and a few other programs designed to help veterans transition back into civilian life. "I've been looking at your file, and we've got a couple of options here," Frank begins, gesturing to the papers. "First off, we have a few spots available in a housing program for veterans who are getting back on their feet. It's not much at first, but it'll give you a stable place to live while you work on the other pieces: therapy, job training, and, eventually, getting back into the workforce." Michael takes the papers, looking over them briefly. The idea of having a place of his own space where he could feel safe and secure, feels foreign, almost like a dream. But Frank's calm, steady voice is reassuring. "Then, there's the therapy program. We work with professionals who specialize in PTSD, depression, and anxiety. I know the war didn't just leave physical scars, but these programs, they're designed to help you heal. You don't have to go through it alone. Michael's hands tremble slightly as he looks at the papers. It's all so overwhelming. Therapy? A steady job? A home? He's been living on the streets for so long that the idea of stability feels like an alien concept. It's terrifying, but deep down, he knows it's the only way forward. I've never really done therapy, Michael admits quietly, avoiding Frank's eyes. I've tried, but I don't know. It's hard to trust people, you know? Frank doesn't push. Instead, he offers a soft, understanding smile. I get it. Trusting people after everything you've been through isn't easy. But the right people are out there, and we can help you find them. You won't be alone in this. Michael nods slowly, absorbing Frank's words. There's something about his sincerity that makes it easier to believe. Maybe he could do this. Maybe it's time to take that first step. 2 weeks later. The next 2 weeks are a blur. Michael has moved into a small apartment in a veterans housing program, one that's not much to look at, but it's his. The first night in his new place, he sat on the couch, staring at the bare walls, unsure of what to do. For the first time in years, he didn't have to worry about someone stealing his stuff while he slept, or being chased out of a corner. It was a feeling he hadn't known in a long time, and it took him a few days to get used to it. The therapy session started soon after. At first, Michael hated every minute of it. Talking about the war, talking about the things he'd done, the things he'd seen. It felt like tearing open old wounds, only to find they were deeper than he realized. But week after week, as he slowly let the pain rise to the surface, he started to feel lighter. He started to feel like he wasn't just a soldier anymore, a broken man wandering the streets. He was Michael again. The job program. Frank had also encouraged him to consider the job training program they offered. At first, Michael thought it was a joke. He hadn't had a steady job in years, and the thought of working again was terrifying. But after the therapy session started to help, after he started to feel more like himself, the idea didn't seem as impossible. He signed up for a trade skills course, plumbing, electrical work, something practical he could do. And to his surprise, he was actually good at it. The first time he fixed a broken pipe in the small training workshop, he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had a purpose again. He was doing something. A new purpose. One cold afternoon, Michael was walking home from class when he passed by a street corner he had stood on countless times, holding his sign. It was as if the universe was showing him how far he had come. The familiar faces were still there. People in need, people struggling. But for the first time, he didn't feel like one of them. Michael didn't stop. Instead, he kept walking toward his new life, toward the unknown future that lay ahead. He had no idea where it would lead, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop. He had come too far. And the next time he saw Barron, he would have a story to tell. The sound of the old subway train rattling beneath his feet was oddly comforting to Michael. As the train moved through the tunnels beneath New York City, he sat with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, trying to focus on the moment. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of appointments, paperwork, therapy, and the overwhelming sensation of trying to keep his head above water. But today, he felt different, more grounded, more at peace. His hands had stopped trembling so much. His thoughts were clearer, and the tension in his chest, that tight knot of fear and uncertainty that had defined his every day for the past 5 years, was loosening, slowly but surely. For the first time in a long time, he was starting to believe he could really turn things around. The first therapy session. Michael had always avoided therapy like the plague. He'd seen therapists before, different ones in different places, and every time, it had felt like an exercise in futility. He couldn't explain what he was feeling, couldn't put words to the invisible wounds that seemed to fester inside him. And when he did try, all he got were blank stares or awkward silences. The therapist seemed to want him to talk about his feelings, to open up, but that felt like an impossible task. How do you talk about something that makes no sense? How do you explain the ghosts of war that still haunted your nights? But Frank had made it clear that therapy was a vital part of the process. So Michael had reluctantly agreed, promising himself he would give it one last try. And now, after several sessions, something had changed. The therapist, Dr. Haynes, was different from the others. She didn't push him to talk before he was ready, didn't expect him to be anyone but who he was. And slowly, over time, Michael began to open up. Not about the war, at least, not yet, but about the little things. The isolation, the exhaustion, the fear of being stuck forever. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And it felt huge. The job training program. The job training program had also been a revelation for Michael. He had never thought of himself as someone who could learn a trade. After all, he had been a soldier, not a handyman. But when Frank had insisted that he give it a try, Michael had agreed. Maybe it would be a distraction. Maybe it would give him something to focus on, a way to get out of his own head. He had signed up for plumbing, something practical, something he could do. The first day in the workshop had been an eye-opener. There was something satisfying about working with his hands, about learning something new. It felt like he was building something, maybe even himself. When he fixed his first pipe, it felt like an achievement. It felt like he had fixed something, even if it was just a small leak. Every day in class, he grew a little more confident, a little more sure of himself. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't a homeless man, begging for change. He was Michael again, learning, growing, and finding his place in the world once more. The first paycheck. 2 weeks later, Michael stood outside the small hardware store, clutching his first paycheck. It wasn't much, not even enough to cover all his bills, but it was a start. He had worked for it. He had earned it. It was his. As he looked at the check, the weight of it hit him. The realization that he could provide for himself, that he wasn't dependent on others to survive. It was an incredible feeling, one that brought with it a new sense of pride and independence. He stood there for a few moments, staring at the check in his hands, and then, almost on instinct, he found himself walking down the street toward the corner where he used to stand, holding up his cardboard sign, hoping for spare change. But as he neared the spot, he stopped. There were the usual faces there. The same tired eyes, the same signs, the same helplessness. And for the first time in years, Michael didn't feel like one of them. He didn't feel trapped. He took a deep breath, glanced at the corner one last time, and then turned away. He didn't need to stand there anymore. He had a job, a roof over his head, and a chance at something better. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And that was enough for now. An unexpected call. Later that afternoon, Michael was sitting at his kitchen table, a bowl of cereal in front of him, when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code matched that of the Veterans Center. He picked up the phone, hesitant, but curious. "Hello?" "Michael, it's Frank," came the familiar voice. "How's it going?" "Hey, Frank," Michael replied, a little surprised to hear from him. "Things are good. Really good, actually. I got my first paycheck today." Frank chuckled. "I'm glad to hear that, but that's not why I'm calling. I wanted to let you know that there's a new program we're starting, and I think you'd be perfect for it." Michael sat up straighter. "A new program?" "Yeah," Frank said, his voice enthusiastic. "It's a mentorship program for veterans who are transitioning back into civilian life. We've got a few people who've been through the same kind of stuff you have, and we're looking for someone to help guide them, share your story, offer advice, and maybe even help them find their footing." Michael was silent for a moment, his mind processing what Frank had just said. He didn't know if he was ready to mentor anyone. He still felt like he was figuring things out for himself. But then he thought about the men and women he had met in the Veterans Housing Program. Some of them had been through the same things he had, and some of them still had that hopeless look in their eyes. Maybe he could help them. Maybe telling his story could give them the hope that he had found. "I'll think about it," Michael said, his voice quieter than usual. "But I think I could do it." Frank's tone softened, a smile audible in his voice. "I knew you would. You've come a long way, Michael, and I think you've got a lot to offer." The decision to help. That evening, after dinner, Michael sat down on his couch, staring at the TV but not really watching. His thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with Frank. The idea of helping others felt like a huge step, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. But there was something deep inside him that said it was the right thing to do. Helping others had always been part of his identity as a soldier. And maybe, just maybe, it could be part of his new life too. He looked out the window, his gaze lingering on the city below. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the buildings. For the first time in a long time, Michael didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like he belonged here, like he had a place in the world. And that, he realized, was a victory. A small victory, but one that was worth celebrating. Michael had been working at the plumbing company for a month now, and every day felt like an uphill battle. The work itself wasn't difficult. After all, plumbing was practical and hands-on, and Michael found comfort in it. But the real challenge was the emotions that came with it. For the first time in years, he was forced to confront the quiet loneliness that had settled in his chest like a permanent fixture. At night, when he laid in his small, sterile apartment, the weight of his past and his uncertainties lingered in the air like smoke. His therapy sessions helped, but he was still grappling with the fact that after all this time, years of surviving on the streets, fighting battles no one could understand, he was still trying to piece his life together. He wasn't used to having a routine. He wasn't used to having a job or a place to go every day. The noise of the world, the responsibility, felt like an intrusion sometimes. He had always been the guy who didn't expect much from life, who never thought he'd make it out of the hole he'd dug for himself. But now, with each day that passed, with every paycheck he earned, he found himself questioning everything he had once accepted as true about himself. Was he really worthy of this? Did he truly deserve a second chance? The question gnawed at him, late at night, in the moments before sleep. The first day of mentoring. It was an ordinary Wednesday when Frank called with the news. "Michael, it's time. Your first day as a mentor is tomorrow." Michael had expected it to feel different, more exciting, more energizing. But when the call came, all he felt was dread. He had agreed to the mentorship program with the best of intentions. He thought it would be good for him, a chance to give back and maybe find some closure for himself. But now, facing the reality of it, he wondered if he was really the right person to help anyone. "What if I mess up?" he muttered to himself as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone in his hand. Frank's voice was steady and confident. "You won't mess up. You've been through a lot, Michael. But that's what makes you valuable. You have experience. You know what it's like to be lost, to feel hopeless. And now, you're finding your way back. They need to hear that. Your story matters." It was hard to argue with Frank's logic. Michael had been where these men were, stuck in a cycle of despair, convinced there was no way out. Maybe, just maybe, sharing his experience would give someone else the courage to try, the same way Frank had given him a hand when he was at rock bottom. The meeting. The next day, Michael walked into the community center, a bit nervous but determined. Frank was waiting for him in the same room where they had first met, a small, simple space with beige walls, a couple of folding chairs, and a whiteboard in the corner. The others were already there when Michael arrived. There were 4 men in total, each of them looking as lost and uncertain as he had felt not too long ago. They were veterans, each one with their own story, some of them still wearing the scars of war on their faces and in their eyes. They looked at Michael with a mixture of hope and skepticism, unsure of what to expect from him. Frank smiled at Michael when he entered. "This is Michael," he said to the group, his tone warm and reassuring. "He's here to share his story and talk with you about his journey. Just like you, he's been through a lot, and now he's here to help you find your way." The men looked at Michael expectantly, waiting for him to speak. Michael cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. It felt strange, standing in front of these men, knowing he was supposed to be the one who had answers. But he also knew that he had no real answers, only the truth of his own journey, and that was what he had to offer. "I'm Michael," he said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. "I've been where you are. I've seen the darkness. I've been homeless, addicted, lost. I didn't think I'd ever get out, but I did. And so can you." He paused, looking at each of their faces. Some of them were nodding slowly, others were just staring at him, processing his words. "I'm not saying it's easy," Michael continued. "Hell, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But I'm telling you that you're not alone. You don't have to do it on your own. And the first step, just one small step, is the hardest but the most important one." There was a long silence in the room. The men didn't say anything at first, but Michael could see something in their eyes shift. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was disbelief. Either way, it was something. A breakthrough. The meeting ended with Frank thanking everyone for coming. Michael was about to leave when one of the men, a tall guy with a grizzled beard and a deep scar running down his cheek, stopped him. "Hey, Michael," the man said, his voice rough. "You said you were homeless. You said you got clean. How did you do it?" "I've been trying, but I keep slipping back." Michael was taken aback by the question. It was raw, real. It felt like a weight had been placed on his shoulders in that moment, but at the same time, it felt like an honor. This man was reaching out. This man wanted help. "I don't have the perfect answer," Michael said, scratching the back of his neck. "But I'll tell you this, it's not about being perfect. It's about taking things one day at a time. And when you fall down, you get back up. And you keep going. Even if it's just one small step." That's what I did. I just kept taking steps, even when I didn't think I could. The man nodded slowly, taking in Michael's words. "Yeah, I can see that." Michael smiled, feeling a little lighter. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to find his purpose. A new challenge. Over the next few weeks, Michael met with the group regularly. The men seemed to open up to him more and more, sharing their own struggles, their own victories. It wasn't easy for any of them, but slowly, there were small changes. A man who had been living on the streets for years managed to find a part-time job. Another man, who had been caught in a cycle of addiction, celebrated his first month of sobriety. But as Michael worked with the group, he began to realize something. Helping these men was helping him, too. It wasn't just about sharing his story. It was about finding his own healing in the process. Every time he saw a small victory, a step forward, it reminded him that change was possible, no matter how small it seemed. One evening, after a session, Frank took Michael aside. "You're doing great, Michael," Frank said with a proud smile. "I can see the difference in you. You're helping these guys, but you're also helping yourself." Michael looked down at the ground, feeling a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know, Frank," he said softly. "Some days, it feels like I'm just pretending, like I'm not really healed, just faking it." Frank shook his head. "You're not faking it. Healing isn't a destination. It's a process. You're in it, and that's enough." Michael let the words sink in. For the first time in a long time, he realized that maybe it didn't matter how perfect his recovery was. Maybe what mattered was that he kept going, step by step. The first rays of morning sunlight pierced through the blinds of Michael's modest apartment, spilling across the floor in delicate streaks. It was quiet, peaceful, too peaceful, in fact. For so many years, the chaos and noise of the streets had been his constant companion. Now, even though his life was slowly rebuilding itself, one small, steady step at a time, the silence felt almost foreign, almost unnatural. He stretched his legs out, flexing his muscles as he tried to shake off the sleep. He was used to waking up in a haze of exhaustion or disorientation, but now, as he sat up, the world felt more manageable. He'd been working for a couple of months now, making a steady income, attending therapy, and meeting with the other veterans through the mentorship program. But despite these wins, a part of him still felt restless. There was something missing. The same question haunted him, no matter how far he tried to run from it. What next? The call that changed everything. Michael had just finished his morning routine when his phone rang. It was Frank. "Hey, Michael. I need you to come by the center today. We've got an opportunity one think you'll want to hear about." Frank's voice was brisk, but there was an undertone of excitement there that caught Michael's attention. "Sure," Michael replied, wiping the sleep from his eyes. "What's going on?" Frank hesitated for a moment before responding. "A local construction company is looking to hire veterans for a project. It's a pretty good deal, Michael. Steady work, decent pay. They need someone to oversee the team, make sure everything runs smoothly. I think you'd be a great fit." Michael sat up straighter, his mind racing. This was the kind of opportunity he had been waiting for. A chance to finally take charge, to move forward with his life. But it also felt like a risk, a big leap into something he wasn't sure he was ready for. His hands tightened around the phone as he tried to process the offer. The pressure was there. He could feel it. The chance was right in front of him. But did he want it? "You're right," Frank continued, sensing Michael's hesitation. "It's a big step, but I know you can do it. You've come so far. You've got what it takes." Michael felt the familiar weight of doubt sink into his chest. His instincts screamed that he wasn't ready for such responsibility. "I don't know, Frank. I've barely been holding it together myself. How can I lead a team?" Frank's voice softened, but it was firm. "You've led before, Michael. You've been in situations that would break most people. That's why I'm asking you. Don't sell yourself short. You're stronger than you think." Michael hung up the phone, his mind buzzing with possibilities and fear. What was he really afraid of? Was it the fear of failing others? Of not being enough? Or was it the fear of success itself? The pressure of moving forward? Whatever it was, the offer presented a crossroads. The struggle within. The next few days were a blur for Michael. He continued his normal routine: work, therapy, meetings with the group of veterans, but his mind kept drifting back to the construction opportunity. The uncertainty gnawed at him, tugging at him like an unrelenting current. He found himself wandering the streets at night, the familiar hum of the city offering little comfort. The memories of his time in the military, the years spent living on the streets, all swirled together in his mind. He had seen enough hardship to last a lifetime, and yet, here he was, fighting his own internal battles all over again. One evening, after a particularly exhausting session with the group of veterans, Michael found himself standing in front of a diner, staring at his reflection in the window. His face looked older than he felt. The lines on his forehead deepened with age, but his eyes were still the same. Am I really ready for this? He thought about all the times he had been on the edge, ready to quit. The nights spent wondering if he would survive. The days when he couldn't bring himself to get out of bed. "How did I even make it this far?" he whispered to his reflection. It was then that the words Frank had said to him earlier echoed in his mind. "You've been in situations that would break most people." Michael's throat tightened. He had been through hell, and yet he was still standing. He had fought for his life, for his dignity, every single day. He wasn't the man he had been when he first walked into the Veterans Housing Program. He was someone new, someone stronger, someone who could make this work. The decision. By the time Michael arrived at the center that afternoon, he had made up his mind. He had made peace with his fears, understood where they were coming from, and realized that they would always be there, whispering doubts in his ear. But he couldn't let them control him anymore. The opportunity was there, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Frank was waiting for him when he arrived, his face lighting up when he saw Michael step through the door. "You've made up your mind, haven't you?" Frank asked with a knowing smile. Michael nodded, his hands steady for the first time in days. "I'm in. Let's do this." Frank clapped him on the back. "I knew you would be. You're going to be great at this." Michael took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. It was a huge step, a leap into the unknown, but it felt right. A new beginning. The following week, Michael began his training for the construction project. He was quickly thrust into meetings, learning the ins and outs of project management, safety protocols, and how to keep a team motivated. Every day was a challenge, but it was also invigorating. It reminded him of his time in the military, the long hours, the high stakes, but now, he was the one in charge. He was the one making decisions, guiding others, and taking ownership of his future. It wasn't perfect, but Michael had never expected perfection. He understood now that the road to recovery wasn't straight, and it wasn't always easy. It had its bumps, its setbacks, and its moments of doubt. But it also had its triumphs, the quiet victories that mattered most. And this, he realized, was one of them. The first test. A few weeks into the project, Michael faced his first real test. One of the subcontractors had made a mistake on the job site, and it was threatening to delay the entire project. The pressure was on. Everyone was looking to him for a solution, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of responsibility like a heavy blanket. His heart raced. His mind spun. But instead of succumbing to the panic, Michael took a step back. He learned to breathe through the fear, to pause before acting. He gathered his team, calmly laid out the problem, and worked together with them to find a solution. Within hours, they had fixed the issue, and the project was back on track. As Michael stood there, watching his team go back to work, A small smile crept across his face. He had faced a challenge and come through it. It was a small victory, but it was his. The rhythm of the construction site was something Michael had quickly become familiar with. The constant hum of machinery, the clanking of tools, and the low murmur of conversation among the crew became a kind of music in his ears. He had learned to tune into the sounds that mattered most, the ones that signaled something going wrong, or the ones that let him know things were on track. Despite his early success, today felt different. Today, he was standing on the edge of something bigger, something that tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The crisis. It was mid-morning when Michael got the call. He had just finished a meeting with the project manager, reviewing the progress of the foundation when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He excused himself, stepping away from the crew as he answered. "Michael, we've got a problem," Frank's voice crackled through the speaker. "One of the subcontractors, Jackson's team, they've made a major error. The plumbing lines are all off by at least a foot. The whole layout needs to be redone, and it's going to set us back a few days, maybe even a week. We need to act fast." Michael's stomach tightened. The whole crew depended on the work being done on time, and this mistake threatened to derail everything. More than that, it could cause a ripple effect that would affect other contractors and raise the project's costs. "Can we fix it without losing too much time?" Michael asked, his voice steady despite the panic bubbling beneath the surface. "I think so," Frank replied, "but it's going to take someone with authority to keep everything on track. You'll need to step in and manage this directly. The guys will follow you, Michael, but it's going to take a lot of patience and quick thinking." Michael looked out over the site, watching the workers hustle around, unaware of the impending crisis. He knew this was the moment he had feared. His leadership, the one thing he had been unsure of at the start, was now being tested in real time. "I'll handle it," Michael said, with more confidence than he felt. "I'll get it sorted." The first steps. Michael hung up the phone, took a deep breath, and squared his shoulders. This was it. There was no turning back. He had to act. The first thing he did was gather his core team of workers. He needed them to trust him, now more than ever. He couldn't afford for anyone to second-guess his direction. "All right, listen up," Michael called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the site. The workers paused and turned toward him. "We've got a mistake on our hands, and we're behind schedule. Jackson's team messed up the plumbing lines. It's going to set us back a bit, but we can fix it. We're going to work together, get this done right, and get back on track." There was a moment of silence as the crew processed the news. The pressure was palpable, but Michael stood his ground, keeping his tone calm and authoritative. "I know this isn't ideal," he continued, "but I've seen worse, and I know we can handle this. You all have the skills to get this right. I need everyone to focus. We're not just fixing a mistake. We're proving that we can handle anything that comes our way. So let's get to work." The men exchanged looks, then nodded. Michael could feel the shift. He had given them something to believe in, something to rally around. As the team started to move, Michael joined Jackson's team to personally oversee the fix. The task was complicated. They needed to remove several layers of already set concrete, which would take time and precision. But Michael didn't flinch. He worked alongside the crew, directing the efforts and providing hands-on assistance when needed. Every minute counted, and the weight of that fact pressed down on him. For hours, they worked tirelessly. Sweat dripped down Michael's back, his muscles aching with each movement, but he didn't stop. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenge, but he reminded himself of something Frank had told him earlier. "You've been through worse." This was a test, yes, but it was also an opportunity to prove his worth, not just to the crew, but to himself. A shift in the crew. As the day wore on, something started to change. The workers who had been skeptical of Michael's leadership, who had, at one point, seen him as just another man trying to figure it out, began to follow his lead with a newfound respect. They saw the way he handled pressure. They saw how he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, to put in the work alongside them. And that was what won them over. By the end of the day, they had made significant progress in fixing the error. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting there. Michael felt a glimmer of relief in the back of his mind, knowing they were on the right track. Frank arrived on site just before the shift ended. He surveyed the work, taking in the site with a critical eye. When he approached Michael, He gave him a nod of approval. "You did good today, Michael," Frank said with a smile. "I knew you had it in you." Michael exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the day lift off his shoulders. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but we got it done. You didn't just fix a problem. You earned the trust of your team. You earned their respect," Frank said. "That's leadership, Michael. That's what it's all about." Michael felt a sense of pride wash over him. It wasn't just about solving the problem. It was about growing into the leader he needed to be. And in that moment, he realized something profound. Maybe he wasn't pretending anymore. Maybe he was really becoming the person he had always hoped to be. The aftermath. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The project had been delayed, but not as much as they initially feared. The construction was back on track, and the crew worked efficiently, with Michael leading them through each challenge. His confidence had grown, and so had his connection to the team. He wasn't just overseeing their work, he was part of it, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as Michael walked around the site, checking in with the different crews, he overheard a conversation between two workers. "You know, I wasn't sure about Michael at first," one of them said, "but the way he handled that mess with the plumbing, he's got it. He's the guy we need leading us." The other worker nodded. "Yeah, I agree. He doesn't just talk the talk. He walks the walk." Michael smiled to himself. It wasn't the kind of recognition he had ever sought out, but hearing it from his team meant more than any title or position ever could. A new kind of confidence. The next day, Michael sat down with Frank to discuss the progress of the project. It was nearing its final stages, and everything was moving smoothly. But Michael was no longer just focused on the task at hand. He was beginning to think bigger. "I've been thinking," Michael started, hesitating slightly, "maybe I can do more. I mean, this project is great, but what if I could take on more responsibility? What if I could manage multiple sites? I want to do more. I think I'm ready for it." Frank leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "I knew you'd get there, Michael. You're not the same guy who walked in here a few months ago. You've grown. You've proven that you've got the skills and the heart to lead. If you're ready, we can talk about opportunities for you to take on more." Michael's heart raced. He had started as a broken man with no direction, but now he could see a future for himself. A future where he didn't just survive, but thrived. "I'm ready," Michael said, his voice full of determination. Frank smiled, proud of the man sitting across from him. "All right then, let's make it happen." It had been several weeks since the plumbing crisis had been resolved, and the project was back on track. Michael had managed to lead his team through what could have been a catastrophic delay, earning respect from everyone on the site in the process. But despite the victories and newfound sense of purpose, something still gnawed at him. The deeper he got into his role as a leader, the more the pressures mounted and the heavier the responsibilities became. One evening, after a long day on the job site, Michael sat in his apartment, staring at the pile of paperwork on the small kitchen table. His mind felt like it was buzzing, overwhelmed with the sheer amount of things that needed his attention. He was still adjusting to the demanding nature of his new position. Meetings, budgets, schedules, all while managing a team of workers who relied on him. He had come far since the days when he was homeless, living on the streets, with no future and no hope. But now, in the quiet moments, as he tried to unwind, the weight of his choices started to sink in. He had moved past the worst of his addiction, found a job, gained stability. But could he really continue to lead at this pace? Could he continue to balance the professional world with his personal recovery? The constant pressure to succeed was making him question whether he could handle it all. He wanted to be the man he had promised he'd become, the one who made a difference, who could lead others, but it felt like he was losing himself in the process. The unexpected call. The phone rang, breaking his thoughts. Michael looked down at the screen, seeing Frank's name flashing. He hesitated for a second before answering. "Hey, Frank," Michael said, his voice a little quieter than usual. "Michael, we need to talk," Frank replied. There was something in his tone that immediately grabbed Michael's attention, something serious. "Sure, what's up?" "It's about the project," Frank said. "We've hit another bump. The subcontractors are running behind on their end of things, and it's throwing everything off schedule again. The guys are getting frustrated, and tensions are rising." I need you to come by tomorrow morning and help resolve this. It's crucial. Michael rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the exhaustion that had crept in. The last thing he wanted was more trouble to deal with. He had already invested so much energy into this project, so much effort into being the leader they needed him to be. Could he take on another setback? I'll be there, Michael said, his voice firm, even though his heart wasn't entirely sure. A struggle of priorities. The next morning, as Michael made his way to the site, he thought about the pressure that had been building in his life. The job, the relationships, his ongoing recovery. Everything was pulling him in different directions. He had worked so hard to get here, but it felt like the further he climbed, the more fragile everything became. He couldn't keep up with every demand, and the stakes seemed to rise higher with each passing day. When Michael arrived at the site, Frank was waiting for him, looking grim. "Things aren't looking good, Michael," Frank said, his voice low. "We've lost momentum. The subcontractors are late on their deliveries, and if we don't get this resolved soon, we'll miss the deadline. And that means penalties for the company." Michael felt his shoulders tighten. The pressure was on him now to pull everything together again. He took a deep breath, putting on the calm face he had been perfecting for weeks. "Let's meet with the subcontractors, figure out where we stand," Michael said, his mind already racing through potential solutions. "We'll get this back on track. We have to." As the day wore on, Michael navigated tense discussions with the subcontractors, trying to keep the peace while also being firm in his demands. The frustration was palpable. The workers were tired, the deadlines were looming, and the mistakes from earlier in the project were still weighing heavily on everyone. Michael tried to hold his ground, but the strain was starting to show. He had learned the importance of patience, but today it felt as if patience was in short supply. The cost of leadership. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael walked away from the site, feeling the full weight of the day on his shoulders. He had managed to work out a temporary solution with the subcontractors, but the victory felt hollow. There was no celebration, no relief, just the ongoing pressure to make sure everything stayed on track. As he walked through the streets of the city, Michael found himself alone with his thoughts. The external pressure was one thing, but the internal conflict was even more exhausting. He wasn't just worried about the project or his team. He was worried about himself. Was this the life he had wanted? Was this success worth it if it came at the cost of his peace of mind? Michael knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But the deeper he got into his leadership role, the more he felt like he was being pulled away from his own personal journey. He had started this path to heal, to find stability, to rebuild his life. But the more responsibility he took on, the more distant his recovery seemed to become. The loneliness of it all crept in, slowly but steadily. He missed the simplicity of his old life, the times when he didn't have to answer to anyone, when the weight of the world didn't sit on his chest. He missed the freedom he once had, even though he knew that freedom had been toxic. Seeking balance. That night, Michael sat at the kitchen table in his apartment, staring at the piles of paperwork again. His eyes wandered to the framed picture of his old unit on the wall. He had kept it all these years, not just as a memory of the past, but as a reminder of who he had once been and who he was trying to become. But now, as he looked at the photo, he realized something important. His recovery wasn't just about finding stability or success in the outside world. It was about balance, about learning to manage both his responsibilities and his need for personal peace. He couldn't continue pushing himself to the breaking point. The phone buzzed again, this time with a message from another veteran in the support group. "Hey, Michael, we're meeting tomorrow night for a group session. You should come by. We could all use your insight." Michael stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. He hadn't been to a group session in a couple of weeks. The idea of going felt like a small, safe anchor in the chaos he was living through. It reminded him that there was still more to his life than the pressure of being a leader in a high-stakes project. For the first time in a while, he made the decision to attend. It felt like the right thing to do. He needed the support, needed to reconnect with people who understood him, who were on a similar journey. The awakening. The group session that night was exactly what Michael needed. As he sat in the circle, surrounded by veterans who had all faced their own struggles, he felt the weight of his own thoughts ease. For once, the external pressures faded away. They weren't talking about deadlines or budgets. They were talking about their personal lives, their recovery, their fears, and their triumphs. When it was his turn to speak, Michael didn't know exactly what to say, but he felt an overwhelming urge to be honest. "I've been feeling like I'm juggling a lot," he admitted, his voice a little shaky. "I've got this project, the team, all this responsibility, and I feel like I'm losing myself in the process. I'm doing things I never thought I could do. But sometimes, I wonder if it's worth it, you know? The cost of success, it feels high." There was a silence, and then one of the veterans, an older man named Tom, nodded thoughtfully. "The price of progress is steep for all of us, Michael. But don't forget what got you here. You're not doing this alone. And you don't have to carry the weight by yourself, either." His words hit Michael harder than he expected. He realized that no matter how far he had come, he didn't have to do it alone. The weight of his journey, his leadership, his recovery, was something that could be shared, not shouldered by him alone. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't expected to be perfect. There was a way forward, one that didn't require sacrificing his soul for success. The day after the group session, Michael woke up feeling a strange sense of calm. For the first time in a while, he felt like he had something of a roadmap, not for the construction project, not for his role as a leader, but for himself. The previous night's conversation with his fellow veterans had given him a new perspective. They had shared their struggles, their own versions of success and failure, and the pressure they'd felt to keep going. But what had resonated with Michael the most was something Tom, the older veteran, had said. "Don't forget what got you here. You're not doing this alone. And you don't have to carry the weight by yourself, either." Michael realized that he had been so focused on proving himself, on managing the construction site and being the leader everyone needed, that he had forgotten to check in with himself. The journey hadn't just been about getting things right on the outside. It had to be about finding peace within, too. The first step toward change. The morning light poured through the blinds, casting a soft glow across Michael's modest apartment. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. The man who stared back at him was different from the one he had been a year ago. He could see the change in his eyes. There was a weariness, yes, but also a spark. He had made it through the darkness, but now it was time to deal with the rest of the journey. The part that wasn't just about survival but about living. With a deep breath, Michael made a decision. He needed to take control of his time and his mental space, just as he had taken control of his work life. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. He had always focused on the next big hurdle, the next task to tackle, but now, for once, he had to focus on something else. Himself. He grabbed his phone and texted Frank. "Hey Frank, can we meet up later today? Need to talk about something." A moment later, Frank responded, "Sure, Michael. I'll be free after 2. Let me know where." Michael put the phone down and walked to the kitchen to brew some coffee. His mind was already racing, but this time, it wasn't about the project. It was about something deeper. He couldn't keep pushing through without addressing his own needs. He needed to have a conversation with Frank, not just about work, but about his personal limits, his boundaries. He had to make sure that he didn't burn out. The meeting with Frank. By 2 p.m., Michael was sitting in a small cafe just a few blocks from the construction site. He had chosen this spot for its quiet atmosphere, away from the usual hustle and bustle of the job site. It was a small oasis in the middle of the city, something that reminded him that there was more to life than the constant noise and pressure. When Frank walked in, Michael immediately stood up, offering a handshake. "Hey, Michael, what's up?" Frank asked, sitting down. Michael hesitated for a moment. He had thought about how to frame this conversation, but now that the time had come, he wasn't entirely sure where to start. "Frank, I've been thinking a lot lately. About everything," Michael began, his voice steady. "The project, my role as a leader, my recovery. It's a lot, man. And I think I've been pushing myself too hard. I've been so focused on keeping everything together at work that I've neglected the fact that I'm still a human being, you know? I still need to take care of myself." Frank leaned forward, his expression serious but not judgmental. "I hear you, Michael. It's tough. This job, the demands of leadership, they'll take everything out of you if you let them. But it sounds like you're realizing something important. Your own well-being comes first. If you're burned out, you won't be able to give your best to the project or to anyone else. So what are you thinking? How can I help? Michael let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lift just a little bit. He wasn't used to being this vulnerable, but Frank had been his mentor, his guide in many ways, and now it was time to be honest. I think I need to step back for a bit, Michael said slowly. Maybe take a few days off. Not from the project, but from being in the trenches every single day. I can't keep going like this. I want to stay involved, but I need to find balance. And I'm not sure how to do that on my own. Frank nodded, absorbing Michael's words. That's a big step, Michael. It takes a lot of strength to admit that. But you're right. You can't keep burning the candle at both ends and expect to keep going. Taking time for yourself isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. And trust me, you're not alone in this. If you need to take a step back and reassess, that's okay. Michael was surprised at how much relief he felt just by having the conversation. He had been so afraid of letting people down, of seeming weak or incapable, but Frank's response was the opposite of what he had feared. Frank was supportive, understanding, just like he always had been. You've been doing a great job, Michael. But don't forget to take care of yourself, Frank said, offering a reassuring smile. You've earned the right to take a breather. Take the time you need to recharge, and then we'll come up with a plan. You're not going to lose momentum. Trust me. The first step toward balance. Over the next few days, Michael took a step back from the construction site. He wasn't quitting, far from it, but he knew he needed to reset. He focused on small, everyday things. A morning walk, cooking a simple meal, catching up on reading. He even revisited his old support group, spending time with people who understood the internal battles he had fought to get to this point. One evening, as Michael sat on the porch of his apartment, watching the sun set behind the city skyline, he felt a quiet sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to simply be. He wasn't thinking about the next deadline or the next problem to solve. He wasn't consumed by worry or anxiety. It was a rare moment of peace. And in that peace, Michael realized something important. He didn't have to do it all at once. He didn't have to rush to fix everything. The recovery process, the journey to balance, would take time, and that was okay. As the days passed, Michael started to feel more centered. He went back to work, but now he had a new approach. He would still lead, still push toward success, but he wouldn't do it at the expense of his well-being. He would set boundaries, ask for help when he needed it, and take the time to breathe. The reflection. It had been a long, hard road from the streets of Washington, D.C. to where he stood now. Michael had faced incredible challenges, addiction, homelessness, self-doubt, but through it all, he had never given up. And now, with a sense of clarity he hadn't had before, he understood that the journey wasn't just about fighting through each obstacle. It was about finding peace within himself and allowing that peace to guide him forward. The project wasn't over, and the stakes were still high, but Michael knew he had what it took to finish strong. He had proven that to himself. But more importantly, he had learned that true strength came from knowing when to step back, when to rest, and when to seek support. The true test of leadership wasn't just in managing a team. It was in managing oneself. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt ready for whatever came next. Michael's decision to take a step back had been the right one, but as the days passed, he couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. He had learned how to prioritize his well-being, but the responsibility of leading the project, of supporting his team, of ensuring everything ran smoothly, never quite left his mind. The weight of it all was still there, a constant presence at the back of his thoughts. The days he spent away from the job site had been refreshing in some ways. He had caught up on his personal life, spent more time with his support group, and even reconnected with family members he hadn't seen in months. But when he returned to the site, the familiar hum of construction and the urgency of deadlines hit him all over again. He couldn't escape the fact that he was still at the center of it all. He had thought that stepping back would give him a break from the pressure, but it had only given him more time to reflect on just how heavy that pressure had become. A conversation with his father. It was late one evening when Michael received an unexpected call. The name on the screen was his father's, John Collins. They hadn't spoken much since Michael had left for the military, and even less since his return. Their relationship had been strained for years, mostly because of the way his father had treated him growing up. Michael never quite understood his father's expectations, and he often felt as though he couldn't meet them, no matter how hard he tried. "Hey, Dad," Michael answered, trying to hide the tension in his voice. "Michael," his father's voice came through, firm but not unkind. "I've been meaning to check in with you. How are you doing?" Michael paused. It wasn't often that his father reached out, and when he did, it was typically to talk about work or his latest projects. The silence stretched between them as Michael considered how to respond. "I'm managing," Michael replied finally. "A lot going on, you know? The construction project, the team. It's been tough." "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," John said. "I've been hearing about your work from some of the old contacts. Word's getting around about what you've been doing. Impressive stuff, Michael." Michael frowned. He wasn't sure whether to feel pride or frustration. He didn't need his father's approval, but the way John spoke made it sound like that's exactly what he was after. "I didn't do it for anyone else, Dad," Michael replied, his voice tinged with a hint of frustration. "I did it for me." There was a brief silence on the other end. "I get that," his father said. "But listen, I've been thinking a lot about this. Your mother and I, well, we've both been worried about you. We don't hear from you enough, and we know you're under a lot of pressure. Don't burn yourself out. You've come so far. Don't let it slip away now." Michael's chest tightened. His father's words, though rare and somewhat cold, carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. His father had never been one for emotional support, but hearing those words now, concern, however gruffly expressed, felt like a crack in the wall that had always existed between them. "I won't," Michael said, his voice softer. "I'm learning how to handle it. It's just hard sometimes. A lot harder than I thought." "I know it is," his father replied. "But remember, you're not alone in this. We're still your family, even if we're not always around." The conversation ended on a note of quiet understanding, and for the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of connection with his father. It wasn't much, but it was something. He didn't need his father's approval anymore, but the fact that his father had reached out, it meant more than Michael cared to admit. The stress of leadership. The next day, Michael found himself walking through the construction site with renewed determination, though the weight of leadership was still heavy on his shoulders. Despite his father's words, the reality of the project loomed large. He couldn't shake the feeling that every decision he made affected not just the people on the site, but the company, his team, and the reputation he had worked so hard to build. As he approached the blueprints laid out on a table, Frank greeted him, looking a little more tense than usual. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, noticing the concern in Frank's eyes. "We've got a situation," Frank said, his voice tight. "The inspection's coming up, and I'm not sure we're ready. The quality of some of the work on the lower floors isn't up to code, and we're going to need extra hours to get it fixed. I know that's going to stretch the budget and the timeline even more." Michael felt his stomach drop. This was the last thing they needed right now. The team was already stretched thin, and another setback could push everything over the edge. "I'll take care of it," Michael said, his tone firm, even though a knot tightened in his chest. "Let's meet with the workers and see what we can do. I'll handle the budget adjustments." Frank nodded, but didn't look convinced. Michael could see the worry in his eyes, and it mirrored his own. "I've got this," Michael repeated, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Frank or himself. The balancing act. Later that evening, after a long day of coordinating with contractors and managing the fixes on site, Michael sat in his apartment once again, the day's exhaustion settling in. His mind was spinning, running through every detail of the project, the schedules, the workers' concerns. He couldn't help but wonder if he was doing enough, if he was truly leading his team the way they needed, or if he was just keeping things together by sheer force of will. He glanced at the framed picture of his old military unit on the wall, his fingers grazing the glass. Those men had been his brothers, his family when he had nothing else. They had taught him what it meant to push through hardship, to fight for something greater than yourself. But here, in the civilian world, the stakes were different. The pressure was different, and he had no one else to rely on. No brothers in arms, no clear mission to follow. He was doing this on his own. Except, that wasn't entirely true. His mind flickered back to Frank's words, to his father's unexpected call. He wasn't alone in this. He had support. Whether he accepted it or not, he had people who cared about him. Reaching out. The next morning, Michael decided to reach out to one of his old friends from the military, someone who had always been a steadying force in his life, even after they'd left the service. His name was Tony, and they kept in touch over the years, though not as often as Michael would have liked. "Hey, Tony," Michael said when Tony answered the phone. "I've been meaning to check in. Things have been crazy lately. I could really use some advice if you've got the time." "I've always got time for you, brother," Tony replied warmly. "What's going on?" Michael took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. "I've got this big project. I'm leading a construction team, but the stress is getting to me. I'm juggling a million things, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. Honestly, I'm starting to feel like I'm losing control of it all." Tony was silent for a moment. "You know, Michael, we've both been through some pretty intense stuff, but here's what I've learned. You can't lead anyone if you're not leading yourself first. The weight of responsibility is huge, and it can crush you if you let it. But you've got to set boundaries. Take the time you need to stay mentally and physically strong. If you're not taking care of yourself, you won't be able to take care of anyone else." Michael listened, feeling the weight of Tony's words settle in. They were the same lessons he'd heard from his support group, but hearing them from Tony, someone who had been through the same kinds of pressures, made them resonate on a different level. "I needed to hear that," Michael said quietly. "Thanks, Tony. You always know what to say." A new approach. The conversation with Tony was a turning point for Michael. It wasn't that he hadn't heard the advice before, but the reminder felt like a reset. Michael realized that he didn't need to do it all alone. Leadership wasn't about carrying the weight by yourself. It was about knowing when to lean on others, when to ask for help, and when to take a step back for your own sake. With renewed clarity, Michael made a commitment to himself. He would continue to lead, but he would do so with balance. He would prioritize his mental health and well-being just as much as he prioritized the project. He would lead by example, not by pushing himself to the breaking point. And with that, he felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the journey ahead would require more than just strength. It would require wisdom, compassion, and the courage to ask for help when needed. The weeks that followed Michael's conversation with Tony marked a subtle shift in his approach to both leadership and life. Though the weight of responsibility never fully lifted, he began to see the value in delegating, in trusting his team, and in taking the occasional step back to refuel. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself moments of peace, not just in the quiet of his apartment, but also in the midst of the chaos that surrounded him every day on the job. Yet, as much as he tried to adjust, the pressure remained a constant companion. The deadline for the construction project was drawing closer, and the stakes had only gotten higher. The city's officials were breathing down their necks, and the funding was tied up in red tape. Michael couldn't afford any mistakes, not now. A new challenge emerges. One rainy Tuesday morning, as Michael reviewed the latest blueprints with Frank in their makeshift office at the construction site, an unexpected phone call shook him out of his deep concentration. "Michael Collins," a woman's voice said sharply. "Yeah, this is Michael," he responded, glancing at Frank with a raised eyebrow. "I'm Allison Roberts from the city's building inspection office. We've got some concerns regarding the site. We'll be conducting an unannounced inspection tomorrow morning." Michael's stomach dropped. An unscheduled inspection? They'd had inspections scheduled, but none without prior notice. This was new, and it didn't feel like good news. "Wait, an inspection tomorrow?" Michael echoed, trying to steady his voice. "I wasn't informed about this. What concerns are we talking about?" "All I can say right now is that we've noticed discrepancies in your structural work. We'll have a full report once we're on site." "Be ready," she said before hanging up. Michael stood there for a moment, the phone still in his hand, his mind racing. "Discrepancies in structural work?" Frank repeated, his expression serious. "Michael, that's bad. That's the kind of thing that could shut the whole project down." Michael felt the weight of the words. He knew how critical this inspection was. If anything was off, if any part of the building didn't meet the city's stringent code, they could face delays, fines, or worse, a complete shutdown of the site. It wasn't just a question of the project's future. It was about his reputation, his team, everything he had worked for over the past year. Facing the unknown, the night before the inspection, Michael couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through the potential consequences. He had double-checked every part of the project, and while they had run into some minor setbacks, nothing seemed major. Still, the fear of the unknown gnawed at him. What if they missed something? What if the inspectors found an error that no one had seen? It would all come crashing down, and everything he had worked for. His team's hard work, his own efforts, would be in jeopardy. He reached over and grabbed his phone, scrolling through the contacts. He thought about calling Frank, but Frank was already burned out, putting in long hours at the site. He didn't want to burden him more. Instead, Michael reached out to Tony. "Hey Tony, I need some advice," he typed. "We've got an unannounced inspection tomorrow morning, and I'm freaking out a bit. What would you do in my shoes?" Tony replied within minutes. "Take a deep breath, Michael. You've prepared for this. You've got a good team. Lean on them. Trust your gut. And if it helps, get a good night's rest. Tomorrow's a new day. You can handle it." The words were simple, but they grounded him. He'd been taught that leadership was about having all the answers, about being in control. But Tony's message reminded him that leadership was also about trusting the process and his team. The inspection. The next morning, Michael arrived at the construction site early. The air was thick with tension as he and Frank made their rounds, ensuring everything was in place. The workers moved quickly, performing final checks on equipment and materials, while Michael's mind raced through everything that could go wrong. As the clock ticked down, he spotted the inspection team arriving in a city van. Michael's heart rate picked up, and he could feel his palms sweat as he walked toward them. "Mr. Collins, I presume?" one of the inspectors asked, extending a hand. "Yes, that's me," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He shook the inspector's hand. "Let me know what you need to see, and I'll get it for you." The inspection began, and Michael's nerves continued to build as he watched the inspectors scrutinize every corner of the site. The building was impressive. He knew it was, but the fear of something slipping through the cracks made him tense. But then, something unexpected happened. A surprising turn. A few hours later, after what felt like an eternity, the lead inspector, a woman in her late 40s named Allison Roberts, approached Michael with a clipboard in hand. She looked him up and down for a moment, and then spoke. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice professional, but with a hint of something else. "I've been through the site, and I have to say, I'm impressed. Your team has done a commendable job here. I'm happy to report that the project meets the required code standards, and we'll be signing off on the inspection today." Michael blinked, almost in disbelief. "Wait, what? You're passing us?" Allison nodded. "Yes. I'll send the final paperwork through the system this afternoon. Just make sure you keep up with the maintenance and make the adjustments as we discussed. But overall, you're good to go." Michael's chest unclenched as a wave of relief washed over him. He had been expecting the worst, but the inspectors had found nothing major to delay the project. It was a huge win for him and his team. "Thank you," Michael said, shaking her hand again. "This means a lot. You don't know how much we've been working to get this right." "I can see that," she said with a faint smile. "You've got a solid crew here. Don't let up now." As the inspection team packed up and left, Michael turned to Frank, who had been nervously watching from the sidelines. Frank's face broke into a grin. "We did it, Michael," Frank said, clapping him on the back. "We actually did it." Michael exhaled, feeling like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't just a technical victory, it was a personal one, too. He had faced the fear of failure head-on, and in the end, it hadn't been as terrifying as he thought. A moment of reflection. That evening, after the inspection was completed and the team celebrated their victory, Michael sat alone for a moment on the balcony of his apartment. The city stretched out before him, lights twinkling, life moving in its chaotic rhythm. He felt a sense of accomplishment, but also something else, something deeper. He thought about the fear he had felt the night before, the overwhelming anxiety that had nearly crippled him. He realized then that it wasn't the weight of responsibility that had nearly broken him. It was the fear of failure. And in that moment, Michael understood something important. Leadership wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about controlling everything or having all the answers. It was about facing uncertainty with confidence, trusting your team, and knowing that even when things go wrong, you have the strength to adapt and recover. Michael smiled, a quiet sense of peace settling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control, not of everything, but of what truly mattered. And that was enough. Michael's life had always been about taking control, about leading with strength and pushing through obstacles. But after the inspection, something inside him shifted. The victory was sweet, no doubt, but it also brought him face to face with a realization that had been gnawing at him for some time. He didn't have to do it all alone. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. The days following the inspection were filled with a sense of calm he hadn't expected. The team had successfully completed a critical phase of the project, and the city's approval was the final piece to move forward. Yet despite the external success, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more he needed to figure out. He'd been in survival mode for so long, but now, with things seemingly on track, he was left with the quiet of reflection. That afternoon, as the project moved ahead, Michael took a rare break. He sat on the worn bench near the site, watching the workers move around in the background, and for the first time in a while, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, feeling the weight of the past year settle into something more manageable. A chance encounter. As he sat there, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his father. "Got some time for a chat? I know we don't talk much, but I've been thinking about you." The message surprised Michael. He hadn't expected to hear from his dad again so soon after their last conversation. After a moment of hesitation, he responded, "Sure. Call me when you're free." A few minutes later, his phone rang. It was his father's voice, as familiar and gruff as always. "Michael, hey. I know we don't talk a lot, but I've been hearing good things about the project. You've been making waves, son. People are talking." Michael's stomach tightened slightly. Was this another round of his father's backhanded compliments? Was he expecting Michael to be grateful for his approval, for his acknowledgement? "Yeah, I heard," Michael replied, trying to keep his tone even. "Things are moving forward. We passed the inspection, and we're on schedule for the next phase." "That's good," his father said, his voice softer than Michael expected. "But that's not what I wanted to talk about. I've been thinking about how you've handled all this. You've got a lot of pressure on you, don't you?" Michael let out a long breath. The question was loaded with the kind of concern his father rarely expressed, and it caught him off guard. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. It's been a lot. A lot more than I anticipated." "I know what it's like," his father said. "I've been there. And look, son, it's okay to take a step back. You've been pushing yourself for years, trying to prove something. But you don't have to do it all on your own. Sometimes the best thing you can do is lean on the people around you." Michael didn't respond immediately. His father's words were a departure from the usual hard-nosed advice, and they left him with a strange sense of validation. For a moment, he almost felt like his father understood him, that he was speaking from a place of experience, not just judgment. "I don't know, Dad. I've always been the one to carry the load. I don't know how to do it any other way." "Well, maybe it's time to learn," his father replied quietly. "There's no shame in that. Trust the people who've got your back. You've got a solid team, and you've got friends who care about you." A moment of clarity. Later that day, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Michael found himself standing in the middle of the construction site, looking over the progress they'd made. The blueprints lay scattered on a nearby table, a symbol of all the hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. But as he looked around, he realized something. He wasn't alone in this anymore. For all the challenges he'd faced, there was something about this team, about the people he'd surrounded himself with, that made all the difference. Frank, Tony, even his old friends from the military. These were the people who had supported him, helped him get through the tough times. He had always thought that leadership was about standing at the front, taking control, making the decisions. But now, he saw that leadership was also about trust, about knowing when to step back and allow others to step up. In that moment, Michael understood what his father had been trying to tell him. Leaning on others didn't make him weak. It made him stronger. He wasn't just carrying the weight anymore. He was sharing it, reevaluating his priorities. The following weekend, Michael decided to visit his mother. It had been months since they'd last seen each other, and with everything that had been going on, he knew it was time to reconnect. She lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, away from the noise of the construction site. When Michael arrived at her house, she greeted him with a warm hug, and for a moment, he felt like a kid again. "Michael, it's so good to see you," his mother said, stepping back to look at him. "How are you doing?" "Really?" Michael paused. He had learned over the past few months that sometimes, the best thing you could do was be honest. "Honestly, Mom, I'm better. I'm learning to slow down a little, take things one step at a time. It's not easy, but I'm trying." His mother smiled, though there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "That's good, son. I've been worried about you. You've been carrying so much on your shoulders. You don't have to do it alone." It felt like the same conversation he'd been having with everyone lately, his father, Tony, Frank. But somehow, hearing it from his mother brought a sense of relief. Maybe this was the key to what he had been looking for: balance. He didn't have to carry the weight of everything by himself. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. They sat together for hours that afternoon, talking about everything and nothing. Michael felt the last few months of stress and exhaustion start to ebb away, replaced by a quiet sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. A new vision for the future. By the time Michael returned to the site the following Monday, he had a new sense of clarity. He had come to terms with the fact that leadership was not just about guiding others. It was about self-awareness, about knowing when to lead and when to let go. The construction project was still his responsibility, but now, he understood that he didn't have to face it alone. He had a team that trusted him, a team he could rely on. It was time for him to lead in a different way, a way that allowed others to step up, a way that didn't involve carrying everything on his own. He walked into the project's main office, where Frank was already at his desk, working through the morning's reports. "Hey, Frank," Michael said, his voice steady, confident. "I've been thinking. We've got a solid team here, and I want to make sure we're all working together as best as we can. I'm going to be stepping back a little bit on some of the day-to-day stuff. I trust you to handle the things I can't be there for. You've got this, man." Frank looked up at Michael, surprised. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Michael said with a smile. "We're in this together." The weeks following Michael's decision to step back and lean on his team were surprisingly peaceful. His leadership style had evolved, and it seemed to make a positive impact on the project. Frank was handling more of the day-to-day operations, Tony was contributing strategic insights, and the workers on site seemed more motivated than ever. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. But in the back of Michael's mind, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The moment of reckoning. One morning, as Michael reviewed the latest reports from Frank, he came across something that caused his heart to skip a beat. The project was on track, yes, but there were discrepancies in the budget. Small ones, purchases that didn't match up with the invoices, materials that were marked as delivered but hadn't been used on site. At first, Michael thought it was just an oversight, a mistake from someone further down the line. But the more he dug into the records, the more the numbers didn't add up. He called Frank into his office, his voice calm but tense. "Frank, we've got a problem," Michael said, gesturing to the report on his desk. "I'm seeing some discrepancies in the budget. Materials aren't matching up with what we've ordered, and we've got some invoices that don't seem to match the deliveries. What's going on here?" Frank's face fell. He wasn't the kind of person to make excuses, but Michael could see the shift in his demeanor. I don't know, Michael. I thought everything was fine. I'm going to go over it again. I'll get to the bottom of it," Frank replied, his voice laced with concern. Michael nodded, but a sense of unease settled in his stomach. He knew Frank well enough to know that this wasn't something he would let slip through the cracks. But the idea of something being wrong, of someone on the team taking shortcuts, was unbearable. "Frank, check with the suppliers. Double-check the receipts. We can't afford any mistakes. We've got to make sure everything's on track." The discovery. By the end of the day, Frank came to Michael with grim news. "We found the issue," Frank said, his eyes averted. "It's not just small discrepancies. Some of the materials are being marked as delivered but haven't shown up on site at all. And it looks like some of the invoices are being padded. Michael's blood ran cold. What do you mean padded? It looks like someone's been skimming off the top. The supplies were ordered, but they never arrived. And some of the payments, well, let's just say they don't line up. Michael's mind raced. Who's doing this? How long has this been going on? Frank sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know yet. We're working on tracing the source, but it could be anyone. Suppliers, one of the team members, or even someone on the financial side of things. I'll get a team on it. We'll figure this out. Confrontation. The next morning, Michael held a meeting with his senior team, including Tony, Frank, and a few others he trusted. As they gathered around the table in the conference room, Michael felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a simple oversight. It was theft, pure and simple. And worse, it could destroy everything he had worked for. Everyone, we've got a problem, Michael began, his voice steady but hard. There's been some fraudulent activity happening on this project. Materials are missing, and invoices have been falsified. We need to get to the bottom of this, and we need to do it fast. The room was silent for a moment as the team absorbed the gravity of the situation. Then Tony spoke up, his tone calm but firm. Do we have any leads yet? Frank nodded. We've identified some discrepancies in the records, but we need to dig deeper before making any accusations. We're not sure who's involved yet. Michael clenched his fists under the table, his frustration bubbling up. We can't afford to waste time. If we don't act now, we could lose everything. I want names and I want answers. The investigation. Over the next several days, the team launched a full investigation. Frank and his team went through the supply records with a fine-tooth comb, while Tony worked with the financial department to audit the invoices. It wasn't easy, and it was a grueling process, but they had no choice. The longer the fraud went unnoticed, the more damage it would do to the project and Michael's reputation. As the investigation continued, Michael found himself in a difficult position. He had to balance his desire for swift justice with his understanding that the wrong accusation could ruin someone's life. It was hard to maintain trust in his team when he was unsure who he could trust. He even started questioning some of the people closest to him. Finally, after days of digging, the truth came to light. The unexpected culprit. It was one of the junior project managers, someone Michael had trusted without question. Matt, a young man who had shown promise from the beginning, had been falsifying invoices and directing shipments to a separate warehouse, where the stolen materials were sold off. Michael was blindsided. I never thought it would be Matt, Frank said, his voice tinged with disbelief. He's been here since the beginning, always been on top of things. Michael ran a hand through his hair, feeling a mixture of anger and betrayal. I never imagined it. He seemed so trustworthy. What was he thinking? Why do this? Frank sighed. I don't know. Maybe it was just too tempting. He's been under pressure. Maybe that pushed him to it. But the bottom line is, we've got a thief on our hands. The confrontation with Matt. Michael called Matt into his office. His heart pounded as the door opened, and Matt stepped inside, looking nervous. Sit down, Matt, Michael said, his voice cold. I need you to be honest with me. There have been discrepancies in the budget. Materials are going missing, and invoices have been padded. We've traced it back to you. Matt's face drained of color. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he stammered. It started out small, just a little extra here and there. But then it snowballed. I didn't know how to stop. Michael's disappointment was palpable. He had trusted Matt, had given him responsibility. Now that trust had been shattered. You've put everything at risk, Matt. You've jeopardized this entire project, and the people who depend on it. I know, Matt whispered, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I didn't know who else to turn to. Things at home, my finances, I just wanted to make it better. But I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. The fallout. Michael made the difficult decision to fire Matt immediately. He couldn't allow someone who had stolen from the project to stay on. As much as he sympathized with Matt's personal struggles, the integrity of the team and the project had to come first. But as Matt packed up his things, Michael felt a deep sense of loss. The man he had once believed in was now a criminal. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, and that, once broken, was difficult to repair. A bitter lesson. As Michael watched Matt leave the site for the last time, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come and how much further he still had to go. He had been so focused on the success of the project that he had overlooked the human element, the pressures his team members might be facing. It was a bitter lesson, but it was one that Michael would carry with him for the rest of his career. He turned to Frank, who stood silently by his side. "I never expected this, but I guess this is the price of ambition, right?" Frank looked at him, his expression soft but serious. "Ambition is important, Michael, but so is trust. Never lose sight of that." Michael nodded, knowing that this was a lesson he would not soon forget. The fallout from Matt's betrayal lingered like a storm cloud over the project. Michael tried to focus on moving forward, but the damage had been done. Matt's actions had shaken the trust between him and his team, and it was a feeling that wasn't easily shaken off. Every time Michael walked onto the construction site or sat down in a meeting, there was a quiet tension in the air, an unspoken unease that seemed to hang around the edges of every conversation. Despite Frank's efforts to keep the team motivated, Michael knew the psychological toll was far from over. Trust had been broken, and no matter how hard they worked to patch things up, the cracks would remain. The hardest part, Michael thought, was that he had always prided himself on being able to trust people. It was what had kept him going all these years, his ability to surround himself with the right people. But now, the question of who could be trusted lingered in his mind like a splinter. The one person he had relied on had let him down. Tensions rise. As the weeks passed, Michael found himself increasingly distracted. The project was still moving forward, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was off. There were moments when he found himself staring blankly at the spreadsheets, his mind unable to focus. Other times, he would walk through the site, watching the workers move around, and wonder if any of them were hiding something. The paranoia gnawed at him, and he couldn't get rid of it. His relationship with Frank had become strained too. While Frank remained loyal, there was an unspoken distance between them that hadn't been there before. The trust between them had been tested, and even though they were both trying to move past Matt's betrayal, the weight of it lingered. Frank was still his right hand on the project, but something had changed in their dynamic. One evening, after another long day of meetings and site inspections, Michael was walking out of the office when Frank stopped him in the hallway. "Michael," Frank began, his voice tentative. "I need to talk to you." Michael turned, sensing the seriousness in Frank's tone. "What's going on?" Frank hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. It's about the team. They're not sure where you stand anymore. People are nervous. They're not sure if they can trust you, or if you trust them." Michael felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had worked so hard to maintain his integrity, to do things the right way. But now, his own team was questioning him. He had thought that by taking a step back, by allowing others to take on more responsibility, he would build stronger relationships. But it seemed the opposite had happened. "I know it's been tough," Frank continued, sensing the frustration in Michael's silence. "But we need to address this. People need reassurance. They need to know we're all in this together." Michael ran a hand through his hair, the weight of leadership bearing down on him. "I don't know what to do, Frank. Everything feels like it's falling apart. I don't know who I can trust anymore." Frank stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've got to trust the process, Michael. We've been through a lot. But the people who are still here are the ones who believe in you. It's time to show them that you believe in them too." The breaking point. The conversation with Frank, though well-intentioned, only served to increase Michael's inner turmoil. His thoughts were racing, and he found himself tossing and turning that night, unable to find rest. His mind replayed every decision he had made, every mistake, every misstep. Was the project worth it? Was it worth losing his sense of self, his peace of mind, for success? The next morning, as Michael entered the office, the weight of the situation bore down on him more than ever. He found Frank waiting for him, a file in hand. "I've got the latest reports from the financial team," Frank said, his voice steady but guarded. "There are still some issues with the budget. Some of the suppliers are raising their prices, and there are still discrepancies in the delivery records. We need to act fast before this spirals out of control. Michael looked at the report, his eyes scanning the numbers. Everything seemed like it was falling apart, and his shoulders sagged under the weight of it all. It was as if every aspect of his life was suddenly spiraling out of control. "Frank, I don't know how much more I can handle," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm losing my grip on this whole thing." Frank studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "Michael, listen to me. You've been carrying this weight alone for too long. You don't have to do it all by yourself. We've got a team. We've got people who want to help. You just have to let them." Michael was silent, the truth of Frank's words sinking in slowly. He had been so focused on doing everything himself, proving that he could handle it all, that he had neglected the very thing that had gotten him this far. His team. It wasn't just about him. It was about the people around him, the ones who had put in the effort and believed in the vision he had laid out. He had to trust them. He had to let go. The moment of clarity. Later that day, Michael took a walk around the construction site, taking in the progress. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air, and the workers were all focused, determined. It was in that moment, surrounded by the energy and the noise of the project, that it hit him. He had lost sight of why he had started this journey in the first place. This project wasn't about him proving anything to anyone. It was about something bigger. It was about creating something that would last, something that would make a difference. And for that, he needed the help of his team. He couldn't build this alone, no matter how hard he tried. Michael returned to the office that afternoon with a new sense of purpose. He called an all-hands meeting with his team, the workers, the project managers, the engineers, everyone who had been part of the journey so far. He needed to lay everything on the table, to be honest with them about where things stood. The rebuilding process. As the team gathered, Michael stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding. For the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. But he knew it was necessary. "Look, I've made mistakes," he began, his voice steady but raw. "I've tried to do everything myself, and it hasn't worked. I've lost sight of what's important. I've neglected the people who are here with me every day, each and every one of you. I need your help. We need to work together as a team if we're going to finish this project successfully." The room was silent for a moment, but then Frank, ever the steadying force, stood up and nodded. "We're with you, Michael. We always have been." The rest of the team followed suit, and for the first time in weeks, Michael felt a genuine sense of relief. The walls he had built around himself, the walls that had kept him isolated in his leadership role, began to crumble. The team didn't need a perfect leader. They needed someone who could be real, who could admit when things weren't going as planned and ask for help. A new beginning. As the meeting concluded, Michael felt like a weight had been lifted. The future of the project still held challenges, but he wasn't facing them alone. For the first time in months, he felt like he was leading from a place of strength, not fear. He walked back to his office, his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. He didn't know what the next few months would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer fighting alone. And that, he realized, was exactly what he needed to succeed. The rebuilding phase. The first task was repairing the cracks in the project's foundation, both literally and figuratively. While Frank worked tirelessly to get the finances in order, Michael turned his attention to the human side of the business. He had to rebuild the team's confidence in him, and more importantly, restore the trust that had been eroded over the past few months. He decided to spend more time on site, engaging directly with the workers, talking to the project managers, and holding smaller, more personal meetings with his team members. He listened more than he spoke, asking questions and offering guidance when needed. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere on the site began to shift. There was more collaboration, more open communication, and a sense that everyone, no matter their role, was part of something bigger than themselves. A new vision. One day, as Michael walked through the construction zone, he caught a glimpse of the finished blueprint hanging on the wall. The scale of the project, the ambition behind it, had always been a source of pride for him. But now, standing there, he saw it differently. This wasn't just about building something that would earn accolades or make him a name in the industry. This was about creating something that would matter, a space that could change lives, offer opportunities, and leave a legacy. He thought back to the beginning, When he had first taken on the project, he had been so consumed with the pressure to succeed, to prove himself, that he had lost sight of the bigger picture. Now, with the lessons learned from the last few months, he saw his role as a leader in a new light. It wasn't about pushing people to work harder. It was about empowering them to be their best selves, to believe in the vision, and to trust one another. Later that afternoon, Michael called a meeting with Frank and Tony to share his new vision. "I've been thinking a lot about what we're really building here," Michael began, his tone reflecting a newfound clarity. "This project, it's bigger than just bricks and mortar. It's about creating something that will make a real difference in people's lives. And that's what I want this team to focus on. It's not just about getting to the finish line. It's about making sure we're proud of what we leave behind when we get there." Frank nodded, clearly appreciating the shift in Michael's perspective. "That's what we need, Michael. A renewed sense of purpose. It'll give us something to rally behind." Tony, ever the pragmatic one, raised an eyebrow. "Sounds good, but we still have a lot of work to do. Let's make sure we're aligning our vision with the resources and the timelines we've got." Michael smiled. "I know, but if we're all moving in the same direction, we'll get there faster. And we'll do it right." A test of trust. As Michael's renewed focus on teamwork began to take shape, an unexpected challenge arose. Frank came to him one afternoon with a report that stopped Michael dead in his tracks. "The supplier issue is back," Frank said, showing him the new reports. "The prices are spiking again. This time, it's not just a couple of materials. They've started inflating costs across the board." Michael's stomach dropped. It was the last thing he needed. More financial issues to deal with. But this time, he wasn't going to panic. "We need to confront this head-on," Michael said, setting the report aside. "Call a meeting with the suppliers. I want to know what's going on." The next morning, Michael, Frank, and Tony sat down with a representative from the supplier, a man named Rick who had been difficult to deal with in the past. He had a reputation for pushing the boundaries and testing the limits of contracts. The tension in the room was palpable as Michael sat across from Rick, his eyes steely with determination. "I've been patient with you, Rick," Michael began, his voice calm but firm, "but this is getting out of hand. The prices you've been sending us are unacceptable, and I need an explanation." Rick shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "Look, Michael, you know how it is. Costs are rising everywhere. Materials are hard to come by, and supply chains are unpredictable. We're just trying to keep up." "Don't give me that excuse," Michael replied sharply. "We're already paying a premium for these materials. The numbers you're quoting are inflated, and I won't stand for it. You either bring those prices down, or we'll find a new supplier. It's that simple." There was a long silence as Rick weighed his options. Michael didn't back down. Finally, Rick nodded reluctantly. "Fine. I'll make some calls and see what we can do. But this is a tough market, Michael. You have to understand." "I understand more than you think," Michael said. "And I understand that we have a choice. We'll see who's willing to meet our needs fairly. A hard-won victory." Over the next few days, the pressure of negotiations took its toll, but Michael's persistence paid off. Rick called back with a revised pricing structure that was much more reasonable. It wasn't perfect, but it was a victory. Michael felt a surge of relief. It wasn't just about getting a better deal. It was a reminder that he had the power to shape the outcome, to fight for what his team needed. The power dynamics had shifted, and Michael was no longer afraid to stand up for his team. "I knew you could do it," Frank said, clapping Michael on the back when the news came through. "That was some impressive negotiating." Michael smiled, but it was more than just a moment of victory. It was a symbol of how far he had come. This was no longer just about him. It was about his team, about making decisions that benefited everyone, not just himself. The return of hope. As the project continued to move forward, Michael started to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, tangible hope. The obstacles hadn't gone away, but they no longer seemed insurmountable. With Frank, Tony, and the rest of the team working alongside him, Michael began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. He'd come so close to losing it all. He'd felt the weight of his mistakes, the sting of betrayal, and the crushing pressure of responsibility. But now, he had learned to lead with humility, to lean on his team, and to trust that together they could overcome anything. There were still challenges ahead, tight deadlines, unforeseen setbacks, and the ever-present pressure of the construction world. But Michael felt ready. He had learned the hard way that success wasn't about fighting for the finish line on his own. It was about bringing everyone along with him, trusting them, and working as a unified force. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key to not only finishing the project but making it something truly great. The days after Michael's victory in the supplier negotiation passed slowly, but steadily. For the first time in weeks, the construction site hummed with energy, its workers more motivated, their steps more purposeful. Michael, too, felt a renewed sense of focus, though the pressure of the project still weighed heavily on him. There were so many moving parts to keep track of, so many things that could go wrong. Yet, as each day passed, he could sense the collective momentum growing. However, as is often the case with construction projects, the calm before the storm is rarely a prolonged affair. The small victories, the momentary successes, these were quickly overshadowed by the looming challenges still ahead. And in Michael's case, a new problem was about to rear its head. The first setback. It came on a Thursday afternoon. Michael was reviewing a batch of updated reports in his office when his phone buzzed. It was Frank, his voice grim on the other end. "Michael, we've got a serious problem. The city just notified us that our permits for the next phase of the project are being delayed." Michael's heart sank. Permits were the lifeblood of the project, the red tape that dictated when they could move forward. Without them, the timeline would be thrown into chaos. How long of a delay are we talking about? 3 weeks at least. And that's assuming they don't find more issues. The inspectors flagged some discrepancies in the original plan for the foundation work. They're claiming there's a structural concern. A chill ran down Michael's spine. Structural issues were no small matter. A 3-week delay could set the entire project back months. Not only would they be behind schedule, but the financial ramifications would be huge. "Get me a meeting with the city officials. Now." A reluctant battle. Michael met with Frank and Tony the next morning to plan their approach. They needed to get to the bottom of the problem quickly and resolve it before it could derail the entire project. Frank had already reached out to some city contacts, and Tony had begun digging through the old blueprints and reports to find any potential issues. "Okay, here's the situation," Frank began, spreading a series of maps and permits across the table. The city's inspectors flagged discrepancies in the foundation depth and some of the load-bearing calculations. "We need to make sure the design is sound. If there's a real issue, we might need to make some major adjustments. If not, we need to prove that it's just a misunderstanding." Michael's brow furrowed as he scanned the documents. He knew that getting the city on their side was going to be a battle, especially after everything that had already gone wrong. The relationship with the city had been fragile from the start, with some officials already skeptical of the project due to its size and scope. "We can't afford another setback," Michael said, his voice tight. "We need to show them that we've been following the guidelines to the letter, and we need to do it fast. The longer we're delayed, the harder it'll be to get back on track." Frank nodded, his face stern. "I'll talk to the inspector personally, see if we can get a meeting with the right people. In the meantime, Tony, you and I need to go over every inch of the plans and the calculations again. We can't leave any room for doubt." Tony didn't say much, but Michael could see the weariness in his eyes. They were all starting to feel the strain. But now wasn't the time to let up. If they could resolve this issue quickly, they could avoid even more damage to the project's timeline. The city meeting. 2 days later, Michael, Frank, and Tony found themselves sitting across from a panel of city inspectors and bureaucrats. The room was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. A large stack of papers sat on the table between them, detailing every phase of the project, every permit, every inspection. The head inspector, a tall woman in her 50s named Linda Hayes, peered over the documents with a critical eye. Her glasses perched low on her nose, and she glanced up at Michael, her face unreadable. "Mr. Dillard, we've been reviewing your plans, and I'm afraid there are significant issues that need to be addressed before we can approve the next phase," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We're committed to doing this right. If there's an issue, we'll fix it. But I need to understand exactly what you're seeing." Hayes gestured to a set of blueprints, The foundation depth here is inconsistent with what was originally approved. We've also flagged issues with the load-bearing walls. If this is as serious as we believe it might be, we could be looking at months of rework. The project could be in jeopardy. Michael fought to keep his voice steady. That's not what we've been told by our engineers. We've followed all the original plans to the letter. If there's an error, we need to know exactly where it is. Hayes narrowed her eyes but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to her colleagues, a few murmurs passing between them. After what felt like an eternity, she looked back at Michael. We're going to need to bring in an independent structural engineer to reassess the foundation, she said, her tone matter of fact. Until we get that confirmation, I can't approve the next phase. This is a safety concern, Mr. Dillard. The city's hands are tied. Michael felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. An independent engineer meant more delays, more inspections, and even more paperwork. It wasn't just a setback anymore. It was a crisis. We'll cooperate fully with whatever steps need to be taken, Michael said, trying to keep his composure. But I need to stress the importance of keeping this moving forward. Every day we're delayed costs us money, and it affects the community we're trying to serve. This project has to stay on track. Hayes didn't seem impressed. I understand your concerns, but safety and compliance come first. We'll notify you when we've scheduled the engineer's visit. Until then, there's nothing more we can do. The aftermath. As Michael left the City Hall meeting, he felt his nerves fraying at the edges. He had known things were going too smoothly for too long, but this setback was the worst possible timing. The delay in permits was a serious blow, not just for the schedule but for the morale of the team. He could feel the weight of their expectations on his shoulders. Back at the office, Frank and Tony were already strategizing the next steps, but Michael could sense the frustration in their voices. This wasn't just a problem to solve. It was a crisis that could derail everything they had worked for. We'll get through this, Michael said, trying to reassure them. We've dealt with worse. Frank's expression was grim. I hope so, Michael. But we're running out of options. We need to fix this quickly. A call for help. Late that evening, Michael sat alone in his office, staring at the glowing screen of his computer. The contractor's invoices and expense reports blurred together in front of him as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He ran a hand over his face, trying to think of a way to break through this obstacle. That's when his phone buzzed again. It was Frank. Michael, you need to hear this. Frank's voice was urgent. I've been talking to some contacts, and I've found an engineer who's willing to expedite the assessment. He's the best in the field. If we can bring him on board, we might be able to fast-track this whole process. Michael's heart raced. This could be the break they needed. Get him in here. We can't afford to waste any more time. As he hung up the phone, a renewed sense of hope surged through him. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, this engineer could be the key to weathering it. The following week passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Despite the frustration and uncertainty hanging over the project, Michael remained steadfast. His determination to keep the momentum going had become his anchor, even as he and his team worked tirelessly to resolve the structural issues flagged by the city. The new engineer, Dr. Peter Hammond, was scheduled to visit the site on Monday morning, and Michael knew this could be their last shot at salvaging the project's timeline. The pressure weighed heavily on him, but there was a small part of him, an ember of hope that refused to be extinguished. The engineer's assessment. Monday arrived with a crispness in the air that felt almost symbolic. Michael had been up since 5 a.m., reviewing the latest reports and making sure everything was in order for the engineer's visit. Dr. Hammond was renowned in the field for his expertise, particularly in structural integrity and large-scale construction projects. If anyone could solve their problems, it was him. When Hammond arrived at the site, Michael was waiting by the entrance, extending his hand in greeting. The man was in his late 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and sharp eyes that seemed to absorb every detail in his environment. His crisp white shirt and neatly pressed slacks contrasted sharply with the dusty, chaotic construction site. I appreciate you coming on short notice, Dr. Hammond, Michael said, leading him to the area where the foundation issues had been flagged. Call me Peter, and let's see what we're dealing with. The engineer's voice was calm, methodical, but there was a quiet intensity about him. He surveyed the site, taking note of the workers, the materials, and the surrounding structures. Michael felt a sense of urgency as the minutes ticked by. The tension builds. Michael and Peter walked together through the project, inspecting the foundation's depth and load-bearing elements. Michael watched him closely, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but Hammond remained silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of boots crunching against gravel and the occasional murmur of workers in the distance. Peter finally stopped in front of a section of the foundation, his finger tracing a series of markings on the blueprints. "Here's where the discrepancy lies," he said, his voice low. "The depth of the foundation at this point doesn't match the plans. But it's a minor issue, nothing that can't be corrected in a day or two." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Minor? A wave of relief washed over him, though he kept his face neutral. "So, it's fixable?" Peter looked up from his notes. "Oh, absolutely. It'll require some reworking, but it's not catastrophic. What concerns me more is the load distribution. If it's off even slightly, the weight from the structure above could cause long-term problems." Michael swallowed hard. "How serious are we talking about?" Peter paused, measuring his words carefully. "If the load isn't properly balanced, it could lead to foundation failure, nothing immediate, but you'd see cracks and shifting over time. However," he added, his eyes narrowing slightly, "it's hard to say definitively without running a full diagnostic test. It's a precaution, really." Michael felt a knot in his stomach. A minor issue, yes, but it could easily turn into a major one if they didn't address it swiftly. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. How long would it take to run the full diagnostics? 2, maybe 3 days. "I'd recommend we take that time to make sure everything is up to spec," Peter said. "If there are deeper issues, now is the time to address them." Michael nodded. "Do whatever you need to do. Just, let's make sure we stay on track." Peter gave him a reassuring smile. "You've got it. I'll have my team here in the morning." A turning point. As Peter Hammond and his team began their diagnostic tests, Michael turned his attention back to the rest of the site. The workers were doing their best to keep things moving, but there was a palpable sense of tension in the air. Everyone knew the stakes. If the engineer's report came back unfavorable, it would mean more delays, more financial strain, more lost time. And after all the setbacks they had already faced, the team could only withstand so much more. Back at his office, Michael found Frank and Tony in a meeting, going over the updated financials. Michael walked in, the door creaking behind him, and both men looked up expectantly. "Any word from the engineer?" Tony asked, his face drawn with concern. "We're waiting," Michael said, his voice measured. "Peter's doing a full diagnostic on the foundation. It'll take a couple of days, but he seems confident we can fix whatever issues there are." Frank looked cautiously optimistic. "So, no major red flags yet?" "Not yet," Michael replied, "but it's too early to know for sure." Tony shook his head, clearly frustrated. "This is unbelievable. Every time we think we're getting ahead, something else pops up." Michael leaned against the table, trying to project calm, though his insides were anything but. "We'll get through it. We just need to stay focused." An unexpected ally. As Michael pondered the uncertainty of the next few days, an unexpected phone call came in from an old acquaintance. It was Greg Harrison, a former colleague from his earlier years in the industry. Greg was someone Michael hadn't spoken to in years, a person who had moved to a different city but had kept in touch over the years through occasional emails. "Michael," Greg said when Michael picked up, "I heard about what's going on with your project. I know the pressure's on, and I wanted to offer my help." Michael was taken aback. "Greg, it's been a long time. What do you mean?" Greg's voice was low and serious. "I've been in construction for a long time, and I know how these projects can get derailed. If you're looking for an experienced consultant or just someone to help you work through the red tape, I can be of assistance. I have a few connections at the city, officials I can talk to, engineers I can recommend. You name it." Michael paused. He didn't typically reach out to others for help. He preferred to handle things on his own. But this was different. The stakes were higher than ever. He needed every advantage he could get. "I appreciate it, Greg," Michael said, his tone earnest. "I'll take you up on that. If you've got any contacts who can help smooth things over with the city or get us a faster assessment, I'd be grateful. Greg chuckled on the other end. I've got you covered. I'll make a few calls and keep you posted. Don't worry, Michael. We'll get this thing back on track. The engineers report. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of activity. Peter Hammond and his team worked tirelessly, taking measurements, running tests, and rechecking everything they had already done. Finally, on Wednesday afternoon, Peter called Michael to deliver the results. Michael, Peter's voice came through the phone, sounding as calm as ever. I've got good news. The foundation checks out. There are no structural issues. The load distribution concerns were minor, and with the adjustments we've already made, it's good to go. Michael felt the flood of relief wash over him. After everything they had been through, the news was a lifeline. That's great, Peter. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your help, Michael said, his voice thick with gratitude. Not a problem. Just make sure you keep everything on track from here, Peter advised. We're all good to proceed. The calm after the storm. With Peter's report in hand, Michael breathed a sigh of relief. The project was back on track. For now, at least. He called Frank and Tony to relay the good news, and they were both visibly relieved. But Michael knew the journey wasn't over. The project still had a long road ahead, and there would likely be more obstacles. But for the first time in a while, he could see a clear path forward. As Michael stood in the midst of the construction site that afternoon, watching the workers begin their tasks with renewed energy, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. They had made it through the storm. And while he knew the road ahead would still be difficult, there was now a real sense of possibility. For Michael, this project wasn't just about building a structure. It was about proving to himself that he could overcome adversity, that he could lead his team through any challenge. And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the site, he felt, for the first time in a long while, that they might just be able to finish what they had started. With the foundation issues resolved, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, things seemed to be looking up. The delay from the city was now behind them, and with Dr. Peter Hammond's expertise, the team was ready to press forward. The next phase of the project was on track, and it seemed like they might actually pull this off. But just as quickly as hope had returned, a new problem emerged. One that would test Michael in ways he hadn't anticipated. The events of this week would push his leadership and resolve to the breaking point. The unexpected crisis. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon, when Michael received a call from Frank. His voice was tight with tension. Michael, you need to come to the site. Now. Michael's heart skipped a beat. What's going on, Frank? There's been an accident. One of the workers. He fell from the scaffolding. Michael's blood ran cold. Is he okay? We don't know yet. They're taking him to the hospital, but it doesn't look good. Michael hung up, his mind racing as he drove to the site. The construction site was always a dangerous environment, but accidents like this were rare. Still, when they happened, they were devastating. The thought of one of his workers in critical condition was more than he could bear. The fallout. When Michael arrived at the site, chaos was unfolding. Emergency responders were tending to the injured worker, a young man named Kyle, while a group of workers stood in a small huddle, their faces ashen. Michael felt a knot in his stomach as he approached Frank, who stood by the edge of the scaffolding where Kyle had fallen. What happened? Michael asked, his voice hoarse. Frank ran a hand through his hair, looking down at the ground. Kyle was up on the scaffolding, securing a load, when he lost his balance. We think he slipped. He fell about 20 feet. He hit the ground hard. Michael's eyes went to the area where Kyle had fallen. The impact zone was marked with caution tape, and the sight of the police and paramedics made his stomach turn. Is he going to be okay? Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank shook his head. They're not sure yet. They rushed him to the hospital, but there's a chance he might not make it. The weight of responsibility. The hours that followed were a blur of uncertainty and frantic calls. Michael had to handle the immediate crisis while still keeping the project moving forward. He met with the site safety officer, and they reviewed the procedures that had been in place for the scaffolding. There were checks and balances, protocols, and regular safety meetings, but nothing had prevented the accident from happening. By the time Michael arrived at the hospital later that evening, He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He hadn't been able to shake the image of Kyle lying unconscious on the ground, his body contorted in a way that made it impossible for Michael to ignore the gravity of the situation. When Michael stepped into the hospital room, he found Kyle's mother sitting beside the bed, her face pale with fear. She looked up when he entered, her eyes red from crying. "Mr. Dillard," she said softly, her voice shaky. "Is he going to be okay?" Michael's throat tightened as he took a seat beside her. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't promise anything. "We're doing everything we can. The doctors are doing their best." Her eyes were full of fear and hope, but she didn't speak again. Michael sat quietly for a long while, his thoughts consumed with guilt. He was the one responsible for these men's safety. Every worker on his team, every man and woman on the site, was his responsibility. And now one of them lay in a hospital bed, fighting for his life because of an accident that could have been prevented. A moment of reflection. As Michael sat in the sterile hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead flickering occasionally, a feeling of hopelessness threatened to take over. For all his efforts, all the late nights and hard work he had put into the project, the reality was clear. Nothing could guarantee that things would always go according to plan. The accident was a brutal reminder of that. The construction industry was dangerous, and it wasn't always possible to avoid the inevitable. It wasn't just Kyle's fall that weighed heavily on Michael's heart. It was the fact that the project itself, this dream of building something important for the community, was pushing everything and everyone to the edge. The pressure had mounted so high, and now, one man was paying the price for it. A nurse entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. She checked Kyle's vitals and then left as quietly as she had come. Michael didn't even notice her departure. His mind was on the bigger picture, on the looming questions. Could he continue this project after what had happened? Should he pause and take a step back? What would it mean for him, for his team, if another accident happened? Could he live with that? A critical decision. The next morning, Michael called an emergency meeting with Frank, Tony, and the entire project team. He needed answers. The safety protocols had been in place, but clearly, something had gone wrong. He had to ensure that this wouldn't happen again, no matter the cost. The team gathered in the trailer, their faces tense, a stark contrast to the usual buzz of activity that filled the construction site. Michael stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed as he addressed the group. "Yesterday, one of our own was hurt. Kyle's in critical condition, and that's something none of us should take lightly. We all know the risks of working here, but we also know that it's our responsibility to make this site as safe as possible." He paused, scanning the room. "I need to hear from each of you. What can we do to make sure this never happens again?" Frank was the first to speak. "We've already put in place a lot of safety measures, but maybe we need to review everything again. Go back to basics. We could also bring in a third-party safety consultant to assess the site." Tony nodded in agreement. "We've been so focused on getting the job done that I think we may have lost sight of the fundamentals. Maybe it's time for a full reassessment." Michael let out a breath, his eyes scanning the room. "You're right. I'll arrange for a safety audit, and we'll make sure every single one of us is retrained if necessary. I don't care if it delays the project further. Safety comes first." No one argued. The room was filled with silence as the gravity of the situation settled in. "I also want everyone to check in with their teams," Michael continued. "If anyone feels unsafe, if they have concerns about the work or the site, I want them to speak up. No one is getting hurt on my watch again." A glimmer of hope again. Later that evening, as Michael walked through the empty site, his thoughts were consumed by what had happened and what was still to come. He thought about Kyle, the young man with a family who was depending on him, and how his life had been irreparably changed in an instant. But as the lights from the surrounding city flickered in the distance, something in Michael's heart began to shift. The pressure and guilt still loomed, but there was a glimmer of hope. The project, for all its complications, had brought him closer to understanding what mattered most. It wasn't the building, the money, or the timeline. It was the people who trusted him, the workers, the community, and even the family members who relied on these men for their livelihood. Kyle's accident was a tragedy, but it could also be a catalyst for change. Michael wasn't going to let it be in vain. If it meant slowing down the project to make the site safer, so be it. If it meant investing more time in training and oversight, then that's what would happen. One life was too high a price to pay, and Michael wasn't about to let it happen again. The morning after the safety meeting, the weight of the decision Michael had made still hung heavily over him. The construction site, which had once buzzed with the noise of progress, now felt eerily quiet. Workers were milling about, talking quietly amongst themselves, while others were carefully re-examining the scaffolding and equipment, following the newly implemented safety protocols. The reassessment was in full swing. But for Michael, it wasn't just about the audit, it was about rebuilding trust. Trust with his workers, trust with his investors, and most importantly, trust with himself. After the accident, things could never be the same. There would be no more rushing to meet deadlines at the cost of safety. Not on his watch. The road to redemption. Kyle's condition remained critical, but there was a flicker of hope. His mother had sent Michael a thank you note, expressing her gratitude for his presence during the crisis and for the steps he had taken to ensure the site's safety. It was a small gesture, but to Michael, it felt like a lifeline. It reminded him that despite all the chaos, there was still human connection, still reason to fight. The days that followed were full of constant meetings with safety inspectors, a newly appointed safety consultant, and hours spent reviewing equipment and procedures. The team worked together tirelessly to address every issue that had been raised, no matter how small. They repaired the scaffolding, checked every harness and helmet, and ensured that all safety signs and warnings were clearly visible. Michael couldn't help but think about the larger picture. The accident had forced him to slow down, but in many ways, it had also made him realize how rushed and frazzled the project had become. The pressure to meet deadlines, the looming threat of budget overruns, it had all created an atmosphere of stress, one that had inevitably led to cracks forming in their safety culture. But now, with everything on pause and the audit underway, Michael felt like he was taking a step back. The project had always been about creating something significant for the community, but in the rush to build it, he had forgotten something essential: the people who were building it. A visit to Kyle. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Michael decided to visit the hospital. He had heard that Kyle had shown signs of improvement, though his injuries were still severe. It was a risky decision. There was a part of him that wasn't sure if he could face Kyle's family again, especially given the fact that the accident had been under his watch. But Michael knew that seeing Kyle, even if only for a brief moment, would offer some clarity. When he arrived at the hospital, he found Kyle's mother sitting by his bedside. Her face was tired, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes. Kyle was still unconscious, his body connected to various machines that beeped rhythmically. Michael began, his throat dry. Is he going to be okay? Kyle's mother looked up, offering a small but grateful smile. The doctors say he's stable. His injuries are serious, but he's strong. We're hoping for the best. Michael sat down next to her, his heart heavy. I'm so sorry. I wish I could have done more. You're doing the right thing, Michael, she said gently. Kyle would have wanted you to keep moving forward, to make sure this doesn't happen again. He believes in you. We all do. Her words hit Michael harder than he expected. For a moment, he felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so consumed by the project, by the endless deadlines and pressure, that he had forgotten the human aspect of it all. He had forgotten that this was about more than just steel and concrete. It was about lives, about families, about community. I'll make sure nothing like this happens again, he said, his voice resolute. I promise. The breakthrough. Back at the site, the safety audit was nearly complete. Michael spent most of his days with the auditors, combing through every inch of the site, discussing possible improvements, and putting plans in place for additional training. The workers, while initially frustrated by the delays, had come to understand the importance of these measures. Many of them were relieved that the changes would make their jobs safer, and the morale on the site began to shift. One afternoon, Michael stood by the scaffolding again, the place where Kyle had fallen, and watched as workers climbed it with new harnesses and additional safety rails in place. The sight of the workers using the new systems with such confidence filled Michael with pride. It was a hard-earned victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. Frank and Tony approached him from behind, their faces worn but hopeful. They'd been working just as hard to ensure the safety measures were followed. Everything's looking good, Mike, Frank said. It's going to take some time to fully integrate these changes, but we're on the right track. The team's behind you. We're all in this together. Tony nodded. You did the right thing, and I think it's going to pay off. Michael glanced over at the workers, his thoughts still on Kyle, still on the promise he had made. I hope so. We've got a long road ahead, but if we can make it through this, if we can get this project done safely and right, it'll be worth everything. A new beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the project, though still delayed, began to regain its rhythm. The workers were more confident in their work, and the site was safer than it had ever been. But more than that, Michael had learned something crucial in the aftermath of the accident. Leadership wasn't just about managing people and deadlines. It was about looking out for your team, ensuring they felt valued, respected, and, above all, safe. Kyle had made significant progress in his recovery, though he still had a long road ahead. Michael continued to visit him regularly, offering support to his family and making sure Kyle's position on the project was secured when he was ready to return. The sense of unity among the team grew stronger each day, and the weight of the past few months began to lift. But there was still work to be done. The project was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. The delays had pushed their budget to the limit, and there were still several hurdles to clear before they could move on to the next phase. However, Michael no longer felt the suffocating pressure he had before. Instead, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. The project wasn't just about building a structure, it was about building something that would stand the test of time. Not just the concrete and steel, but the community and the people behind it. The final push. By the end of the month, things were looking up. Kyle had been released from the hospital and was recovering well. The safety audit had been completed, and Michael had signed off on the final report. The new measures had already proven effective, and the team was back on track. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but for the first time in a long while, Michael felt like they were moving in the right direction. The project, which had seemed like an impossible challenge just months earlier, was now within reach. As he stood on the site once again, watching the workers put the finishing touches on the structure, Michael allowed himself a moment of peace. They were going to finish this. They were going to see it through. And no matter what it took, he was going to make sure it was done the right way. This final chapter concludes Michael's journey, a transformation from a project-driven manager to a leader who truly understands the value of people, safety, and community. After a tragic accident forces him to confront the human costs of the project, Michael redefines what success means. No longer just about completion, but about doing things with integrity. In the end, the project is not just a physical structure. It becomes a symbol of resilience, safety, and the importance of looking out for one another, even in the toughest of times. The lessons learned will stay with Michael long after the last nail is driven in.